The childhood of Union General George Thomas is a mystery that historians have attempted to piece together over the years. One reason that it is difficult to explain the young life of one of the Civil War's most standout generals is that he ordered his personal papers to be destroyed after his death, including the letters to and from his wife. Add on to that, Thomas was an intensely private man who spoke little about his personal life. He himself stated that, "All that I did for my government are matters of history, but my private life is my own. I will not have it hawked about in print for the amusement of the curious." Nevertheless, some historians have been able to piece together some semblance of a childhood for the man. He came from what would be considered an upper-middle-class household. His father's family was from Wales, and his mother's family, the Rochelles, were from France. Her family were Protestant refugees that came to Virginia in the late 1600s. The Rochelles were much more affluent than the Thomases. Nevertheless, John Thomas would marry Elizabeth Rochelle. Thomas would be one of 9 children born to the couple in Southampton County, Virginia. When George was born on July 31, 1816, the family lived on a 438-acre farm with 9 slaves and 6 draft animals. By the time George was 13, the family owned 685 acres and 24 slaves, placing them among the wealthiest 10% of white families in the county. His father John served in the Virginia militia during the War of 1812, but saw no combat. At the age of 13, George would lose his father to a farming accident. The death of the patriarch of the family put a financial strain on the family. Elizabeth kept the family afloat by selling off some of her land and turning to her family, specifically her brother John, who was the Southampton County clerk. Her brother gave George's oldest brother, John William Thomas, a job as a deputy for the clerk. Although a multitude of crops were sold in that area of Virginia to the outside market, the Thomases maintained a successful brandy business. Then their next biggest financial staple was hams and other pork products. Because cotton was so profitable, they did grow a small amount of cotton, but their wealth came primarily from brandy and hams. In 1831, 2 years after his father's death, one of the largest slave revolts in American history took place in Southampton County, Virginia. Nat Turner, an African-American preacher, began telling his congregation stories of the Israelites overthrowing their Egyptian oppressors, and through his religious teachings, organized a slave revolt to take place. It began on August 21st when Turner and a band of slaves began destroying homes and killing whites. By the next day, the group had gotten larger, and word about the insurrection had spread throughout the area. The Thomas family was informed that the group was approaching their farm, and they began to flee in a carriage, but thinking that Turner might have guards posted on the road, waiting in ambush, they got out of the carriage and traveled across country, through woods and fields and swamps, to the town of Jerusalem 8 miles away. The Thomases left their slaves on the plantation. Their black overseer hid and watched Turner's band take some of the Thomases' slaves with them. The overseer then rounded up those who were left and made their way to Jerusalem and reported what had happened to the family. Eventually, those slaves who joined Turner from the Thomas plantation found their way to Jerusalem and told the family that they had been taken under duress. The militia put down the revolt, and the Thomases' slaves were not convicted or executed, so it was believed by the people of Southampton County, Virginia, that they did not take part in the revolt. As George grew older, he seemed to have a distaste for politics. He criticized politicians of the period in some of the letters that still survive. No record exists that he joined any political party or even voted. George's oldest brother helped his mother manage the plantation, and it was expected, as George grew into adulthood, that he would need to seek out a profession. At the age of 17, he applied for a job of deputy county clerk. Although his uncle had passed away, the family's connections secured him that position. He was to study to be a lawyer. As a deputy of the county clerk, he would get to work with court proceedings and legal issues and learn his trade. He would need to study in his own time to pass the bar, but it was a good path on which to be. He was only in that position for a few months when his family got the representative from their district to nominate him to the West Point Military Academy. We don't know why he abandoned his pursuit of being a lawyer. He was meticulous with paperwork, he had an analytic mind, and a great work ethic. Great qualities to become a lawyer, and a successful one at that. George left for West Point in May 1836. His brother gave him some advice. "Having done what you conscientiously believe to be right, you may regret, but should never be annoyed by a want of approbation on the part of others." His family had taught him to follow his own moral compass and make his own choices, and then stick to them regardless of the approval or disapproval of others. John Y. Mason was his congressman. When George traveled to West Point, he stopped off in Washington, D.C. to say thank you in person to Mason. The congressman told him that no cadet appointed from our district has ever graduated from the military academy, and if you do not, I would never want to see you again. He arrived at West Point in June 1836 and immediately went into summer encampment, as all new West Point cadets did. One of his bunkmates was a cadet from Ohio named William Tecumseh Sherman. The other was Stuart Van Vliet of New York. Sherman and Thomas would become close during their time at West Point. In this case, opposites did attract, with Sherman being energetic, impulsive, and talkative, while Thomas was calm and deliberate. At the end of June, both Thomas and Sherman passed the entrance exams and then enjoyed themselves in the military duties of camp life. At the end of the summer, before formal classes started, a ball was held where the new cadets could dance with the local girls. As the school year began, hazing was a common practice between the upperclassmen and the new cadets. However, their hazing did not go well when it came to Thomas. An upperclassman barged into their room late at night and began barking orders. Thomas, being 19 and generally older than all the other classmen, walked up to the cadet and said, "Leave this room immediately, or I will throw you through the window." The cadet wasted no time in leaving the room. Vliet remembered that no one attempted to haze them again. He gained two nicknames while at the academy, Old Tom and General Washington. Both came from George being older than most of the cadets and his calm, serious tone that made him appear older than he was. He received few demerits, but those he did accrue were from socializing with other cadets during hours that wasn't permitted. The first 2 years at West Point consisted of learning mathematics, French, and drawing. Thomas did well in French, but initially had trouble in drawing. At the January exam, he was 50th out of 60 cadets in drawing, but with hard work, he eventually finished 6th at the end of the course. In his second year, he was chosen as a cadet officer and was becoming popular with the other students. One reason is he would protect others from hazing and gave them advice on how to improve their studies and drill. In his third year, George took many science classes, some of them taught by the famous biologist Jacob Bailey. Students would send Bailey plant specimens from their frontier outposts, and that allowed Bailey to have one of the largest collections of plant specimens in the United States. Probably brought about because of his fondness for his teacher and his interest in science, George would send the Smithsonian Institute animal specimens from his various outposts. Thomas humorously described one of his cavalry lessons. "We had quite an interesting exhibition here a few days since of the method of using the Polish lance. The performance was by Monsieur Booby, I think. At least that was as near as anybody could come to pronouncing his name, which I think was very well done, for he was certainly the most frightful object I ever saw." Thomas graduated 12th in his class of 42 on July 1st, 1840, and he would enter the artillery. He traveled to New York City to accept his commission as a second lieutenant in Battery D of the 3rd Artillery. When he got there, the unit was preparing to leave for Florida, where they would battle the Seminole Indians as infantry, since artillery was not conducive to the swampy environment. He passed the next several months in relative inactivity in New York. He passed the time with 17 other graduates also posted in the city. To further illustrate his disdain for politics, he wrote to one of his brothers in November that, "We can learn nothing from the papers now but election news, which to me is like no news at all, for I care nothing about them any further than that they are beneficial to our country." The war in Florida was brutal, and many officers resigned their commission during the war or after leaving the territory. Thomas was not dismayed. He saw the war as a possibility for promotion through the ranks. In December 1840, Thomas's unit was sent to Florida. Thomas's unit would arrive in Fort Lauderdale, which was not a city yet, and it was barely a fort, with only a few log huts, a wooden fence, and a few guard towers. At first, Thomas was greatly enamored with the Everglades. He wondered about the proper crops to be grown in the region, but by the summer, his opinion of the region had soured. It was rough duty. He complained to a classmate that his duties are so many that my whole time is taken up. I have to do the duty of commissary, quartermaster, ordnance officer, and adjutant, and if I have time to eat my meals, I think myself most infernal fortunate. What was worse, he was unable to join the combat patrols, as he was always left behind to take care of this infernal place in consequence of being commissary, etc. This will be the only opportunity I shall have of distinguishing myself, and not be able to avail myself of it is too bad. A new post commander arrived in August 1841 named Captain R. Wade. With a new commander, Thomas was allowed to go on patrols. His second patrol was the most eventful. Occurring in November of that year, he, along with Wade, a surgeon, and 60 men, captured a lone Indian who led them to his village. The group of soldiers attacked the village, capturing 20 and killing 8, along with destroying much of their supplies and canoes. During this raid, another Indian, an old man, led them to another village 30 miles away, where they captured 27 more Indians. On their way back to Fort Lauderdale, they destroyed a field of pumpkins, an old hut, a canoe, and captured one more Indian man. Thomas's actions during the patrol gave him a brevet promotion to first lieutenant. In December 1841, a new commander came to Fort Lauderdale, Captain Erasmus D. Keyes, to lead Battery D of the 3rd Artillery. He described Thomas at this time as 6 feet tall, his form perfectly symmetrical, inclining to plumpness. His complexion was blonde, eyes deep blue and large. The shape and carriage of his head corresponded with my idea of a patrician of ancient Rome. Keyes was a captain, but had only served as a staff officer and had little experience in the field, even though he had been in the Army 8 years. Thomas, just in the Army for 1 year, helped Keyes acclimate to the new position. He would not have to suffer in Fort Lauderdale long. They would soon move to New Orleans, where they would be located in much more favorable conditions. For 3 months he enjoyed himself in New Orleans, training new recruits and taking in the sights of the city. After that 3-month stint, the unit was assigned to Fort Moultrie in Charleston Harbor. When he arrived, he was happy to be reunited with both Stuart Van Vliet and William T. Sherman. He would remain at Fort Moultrie until December 1843, when he was transferred to a battery of light artillery, also called flying artillery, at Fort McHenry in Baltimore. The battery consisted of 4 cannons that shot a 6-pound shell, and the cannon, along with the limber, was pulled by a team of 6 horses. Its high mobility made it useful on the battlefield. It was at Fort McHenry that his brevet promotion was made permanent, and he was officially a first lieutenant, and under the command of a senior first lieutenant named Braxton Bragg. The two got along, although one probably would not consider them friends. Bragg did help Thomas during the pre-Civil War period, though. By October 1844, he and his group were assigned to Fort Moultrie in Charleston Harbor again. It was about this time that he began to think seriously about marriage, but was becoming discouraged at the fact that he was not financially secure enough to start a family. He wrote in November 1844, "My desire for female society is fast leaving me, so much so that I have not paid a single visit, and I begin to have all the whims and notions of an old bachelor." Although he wanted to get married soon, he admonished himself to cease thinking of the charms of matrimony at once, for the sooner I do so, so much the sooner I shall be contented with the state of single blessedness. Depression at the state of his singleness gave way to excitement in June 1845, when Thomas got news that his unit was going to Texas. Word was being circulated that a war was about to break out between Mexico and the United States, and Thomas would be on the front lines. He and his unit joined General Zachary Taylor's command at Corpus Christi, Texas in August. They languished at that location for 6 months, while more and more volunteer troops arrived. Poor sanitation and boredom resulted in fights breaking out between the men and illness spreading throughout the camp. On March 8, 1846, Thomas and the rest of Taylor's army marched toward the Rio Grande, a point of contestation between the two countries. The army built a fort at that location, and on May 1st, Taylor marched his army out of the fort, leaving Thomas and his battery stationed inside. Part of the Mexican army laid siege to the fort from May 3rd to May 9th. Thomas and the other soldiers built bomb-proofs to protect them from the Mexican long-range artillery. The light artillery had trouble responding to the enemy cannons because they were out of range most of the time, but they were able to disable at least one Mexican cannon during the siege. Taylor won the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, which forced the enemy opposing the fort to break off the siege. Thomas would see combat again when Zachary Taylor attacked the fortified city of Monterey. Initially, he was involved in a feint toward the Mexican right, but the battle got heated when Bragg's artillery battery, with Thomas commanding one of its guns, was ordered to support an infantry attack in the same sector as the feint. They found that the light artillery did little damage to the forts, and they could not provide adequate support. Plus, when they attempted to deploy their guns in the town, they could only get one gun down the street. Sharpshooters from the tops of houses and long-range artillery forced them to pull back, removing the tack from their dead horses before they left. Over the next several days, Thomas and the battery performed admirable service, driving away a cavalry attack and when ordered to attack the city again, he and the other officers came up with a plan to protect themselves from enemy fire, yet still provide support. The gunners would hide behind the wall of a house, load their piece, then pull the cannon into the street with ropes, fire, and then pull it back behind the wall to load again. Although the cannon fire did little to create enemy casualties, it provided cover for the infantry to maneuver down the streets. The Mexican commander of the town surrendered, and the American army had to rest and be refitted from the casualties suffered at Monterey. In November and December, Thomas took command of the battery, while Bragg was temporarily assigned elsewhere. Bragg would be promoted to captain and sent to another battery, and Captain Thomas W. Sherman would become captain of the battery of which Thomas was a part of. The barrenness of the desert south of Taylor's army prevented him from pursuing the retreating Mexican army. General Winfield Scott would plan an amphibious assault at Veracruz and from there march west to Mexico City. Thinking that Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna would not move against Taylor through the desert, especially once Scott began the occupation of Veracruz, Scott took several thousand troops from Taylor's expedition. Oddly enough, Santa Anna began to march 20,000 men across the barren desert to attack Taylor's small force of about 5,000 men. Santa Anna lost around 4,000 men on their forced march due to dehydration and exhaustion, but the force that made it there was still 3 times larger than Taylor's force. Taylor moved his army just south of the town of Buena Vista to a gap in the terrain called the Narrows. There he positioned most of his force on the eastern side of the road, up which the Mexican army would have to march. Thomas and the gun he commanded was placed near the center of the American line, but when the Mexican army advanced on his position, the infantry providing his gun's support broke and ran, leaving the 2nd Illinois Infantry and a few other cannons to hold the line. The Mexicans surged into the breach, with Thomas and his crew smoothly firing their weapon. The position was being overran due to the vast numbers of the enemy force, but just when Thomas thought he would have to abandon his position, American artillery from Braxton Bragg's battery and infantry support led by Colonel Jefferson Davis quickly sealed the breach and saved the day. After a perceived truce that allowed part of the Mexican army to escape, Santa Anna launched another attack against Thomas's position, and again he was holding off the approaching enemy when infantry and artillery support came up at the last moment. After this engagement, Santa Anna went south to deal with Winfield Scott's army. Thomas and Taylor's army remained in the northern part of Mexico, but the war was basically over for them. When it did end, Thomas remained along the Mexican-Texas border until January 1849, when he obtained a furlough to visit family in Southampton County. On his way to Virginia, he stopped over at Vicksburg, where his brother Benjamin now lived. After visiting with his sibling, he traveled to his home state, and an adoring crowd presented him with a ceremonial sword. He had become a hero in his hometown. Thomas remained in Southampton County for about 6 months until he rejoined his artillery unit at Fort Adams in Rhode Island. There he remained just a little over a month before he and his group were sent back to Florida. It had been 7 years since he had been in the state, and tensions between the Seminoles and whites had simmered down. He arrived in Florida in the fall of 1849 and acted as commander for a series of forts in the state's interior. While there, he felt for the Seminoles in their situation. He had spent his last stint in Florida battling Native Americans, but now sympathized with them. Thomas criticized the federal government for its treatment of them, especially when the Seminoles acted in what he termed good faith and agreed to move to southern Florida away from white settlement to keep from being sent west of the Mississippi River. He wrote to his brother that, as they have agreed to take more territory out of land which would never be settled by whites, it would be by far the best policy to make this treaty with them and get rid of this business. The assignment in the intense Florida heat was miserable, and Thomas longed for another assignment, maybe a commissary assignment in Washington, D.C. He could have easily followed in the footsteps of many West Point graduates and resigned from the Army to take a more lucrative job as an engineer in the private sector. Thomas's decision to remain in the Army seems to have been a moral one, as he viewed the worlds of business and politics as corrupt ones, where honor was not respected and where a man with a high sense of integrity would have a difficult time. Thomas's sense of honor and distaste for the business world led him to stay in the military, regardless of the difficulties of his assignments and the difference between what he earned as an officer and what he could have earned as a commercial engineer. While Thomas languished in Florida, others were working on his behalf. West Point was looking for an instructor of artillery and cavalry, and Braxton Bragg, Thomas's former commander, wrote letters to George's congressman encouraging him to approach the War Department about assigning George to that position. In December 1850, he received the position, and he would officially report for duty on April 1, 1851. When he arrived, Thomas quickly looked over the equipment that he was to use as an instructor. He found that the cannons the cadets were to practice on were old and heavy guns, but he was having to instruct them on light artillery tactics. The horses used for cavalry drill were old and sick, plus those same horses were used to pull artillery. Additionally, the old, hard saddles caused the cadets to have bleeding sores from riding too long. When the weather was bad, they had to perform cavalry exercises in the basement of one of the academic buildings, referred to as the riding hall. Although the basement was 65 feet wide and 200 feet long, 2 rows of iron columns made it difficult to ride their horses in the various formations. Multiple collisions between riders in the iron columns and riders in one another produced numerous injuries to the cadets and the horses. Thomas's predecessor, although having to deal with out-of-date equipment and poor horses, had expanded cavalry lessons from basic riding skills to incorporating the practice of cavalry tactics in the classroom as well as in the field. A system for selecting the best cavalry students as leaders in the West Point cadet troop led to better qualified cadets being assigned to the cavalry. George Thomas would recommend many cadets during his time at West Point, 2 of them being Jeb Stuart and Fitzhugh Lee. Some of his other students included Philip Sheridan, Alexander McCook, James McPherson, John Schofield, Oliver Otis Howard, and John Bell Hood. Thomas also expanded who got to practice on artillery pieces. Before Thomas got there, only 4th-year students got to practice on artillery, but he expanded that to incorporate 2nd and 3rd-year cadets. From the way Thomas managed riding instructions, the cadets gave him a nickname that was to follow him throughout his career. The horses at West Point were too tired, old, and sick to handle hard riding, and Thomas tried to preserve their precarious health by preventing the cadets from riding too fast. In a normal practice session, a student would start moving at a walk, increase to a trot, then a canter, and then a gallop. During Thomas's sessions, the students moved from a walk to a trot and then eagerly awaited the order to speed up. Thomas almost always disappointed them by ordering a slow trot and then walk. Amused and annoyed by their cavalry instructor's refusal to let them ride fast, the cadets started to call him Old Slow Trot, and the name stuck. Although he disappointed them on the field of instruction, the cadets liked Thomas. He genuinely cared for the students' welfare, and they came to him with their concerns, and he would work diligently to help them in any way he could. However, he was strict when it came to lessons. A gentleman who served with Thomas at West Point recalled that Thomas had a cool temper, was respected for his impartial justice, and was appreciated for his courteous bearing and kindly spirit toward the cadets, as he treated them as gentlemen of honor as well as soldiers. He was known as a strict instructor, but when it came to his students outside of class, he was lenient. For example, while an instructor, L.W. Brown and Oliver Otis Howard got into an argument in the mess hall, and Brown hit Howard over the head with a glass, and Howard threw the glass back at Brown. Fighting was a serious offense, but while sitting on the court-martial for Howard and Brown, he simply advocated for extra guard duty to be performed as a punishment. His leniency was so pronounced that the superintendent reprimanded him for leniency. However, another incident showed Thomas as a strict disciplinarian. John Schofield, who was a teaching assistant in the mathematics department, was accused of letting students not in the class into the section, and they made sexually inappropriate and scatological drawings on the board. Schofield was expelled for allowing this to happen, but the War Department asked the Board of Inquiry at West Point to reconsider the expulsion. Thomas and one other instructor were the only ones to vote to continue the expulsion. It seemed as though Schofield would never forgive Thomas for voting against him. In September 1852, Robert E. Lee would become superintendent of West Point, and since Lee and Thomas came from similar backgrounds and were similar in their personalities, they enjoyed working together. Things improved at West Point in March 1853 when Franklin Pierce, the new president, appointed Jefferson Davis as Secretary of War. Davis allocated more funds to West Point to improve the facilities and equipment. Lee personally was able to acquire new horses for the academy when the main cavalry recruiting barracks moved from Carlisle, Pennsylvania to St. Louis, Missouri. As West Point was improving, Thomas was improving himself. He joined the Napoleon Club, started by Dennis Hart Mahan to expand instructors' knowledge of military science. He checked out numerous books about military history and presented a paper to the Napoleon Club about the battles of Frederick the Great. During his time as an instructor at West Point, he began to visit regularly with Frances Lucretia Kellogg of Troy, New York. One of her cousins attended West Point, and Thomas got to know her when she came to visit. He spent more and more time with her and apparently inspired him to read poetry because around this same time, Thomas began checking out poetry books from the library at West Point. Frances was from an old and respected family in the Northeast. Like Thomas, she was of large stature, and also like Thomas, she was reserved in social situations. However, once she came out of her shell, she was incredibly articulate and well-spoken. The two were not together too long before they were married at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Troy on November 17, 1852. In the wedding, he wore his full dress uniform, along with his ceremonial sword the people of Southampton had given him after the Mexican-American War, that he had shipped to him from his family for just that occasion. His family would not attend the wedding, but after the wedding, he would take a few months' leave to take his wife to meet his family. The life of an Army wife isn't easy, and it came with long stints of separation. In September 1853, 200 officers and men in Thomas's old 3rd Artillery died when the ship that was transporting them to California hit a storm. The 3rd Artillery recruited new men throughout the winter, and another attempt was made to reach California in April, but the transport ship was also hit by a storm and disabled. No soldiers were killed, but the ship had to go to Hampton Roads, Virginia for repairs. The War Department needed Thomas's help, so it ordered him to meet the unit in Virginia and to accompany it on a third attempt. He and his unit traveled through the Isthmus of Panama overland and then got to another ship destined for California. They arrived in San Francisco unharmed in June 1854, but Thomas was to take 2 batteries overland to Fort Yuma, which sat in California just across the Colorado River from what would become Arizona. The hot climate and remote location made it one of the most despised military outposts. Before he set out for Fort Yuma, he relived old times with his West Point roommate William T. Sherman, who had left the Army and was operating a bank in California. Thomas left $2,000 for Sherman to invest for him, and they frequently exchanged letters over the next year or so discussing economics and happenings in the area. The remote location was along the southern route that people took to get to California during the gold rush. At first, the Yumas, the Native American tribe in the area, welcomed the influx of people because it allowed them to trade for items they didn't normally have, but the struggle over resources resulted in violence erupting. Fort Yuma's first commander, Samuel P. Hanselman, launched a military campaign against the Yumas. The Yumas retreated without putting up a fight, so Hanselman destroyed their crops and homes. The Yumas sued for peace, and when Thomas arrived, he was expected to keep the peace between the Yumas and the white settlers. The heat was extreme and prevented the units from marching during the day, so they rested in what shade was available during the day and marched at night. Once at the fort, it was so hot in the barracks at night that the men slept on the roofs. Thomas told a funny story that he picked up at Fort Yuma throughout the rest of his life. A notoriously bad man, the story went, died at the fort and was buried. One night, shortly after his funeral, his ghost reappeared at the fort. When his comrades asked the spirit what he wanted, the ghost replied that it was too cold in him for hell, and he had to come back to the fort to get his blankets. While commanding Fort Yuma, Thomas attempted to create good relations with the Yumas. He attempted to learn the language and customs and even acted as a liaison between the Yumas and another tribe to establish a peace between the two groups. Thomas had continued his kindness and open-mindedness toward Native Americans. Thomas sent a list of Yuma words to the Smithsonian Institute and made detailed notes about the people, geography, animals, and plants of the area. In addition to the list of words, he sent soil samples and 12 samples of mammals and reptiles to the institution, preserved in alcohol. In the 1856 Smithsonian Annual Report, they described his contribution as an important addition to our knowledge of the Mexican boundary line that included several new species, the most important of which was the phylostome bat, now known as the California leaf-nosed bat, the first member of that family ever found within the limits of the United States. He contributed significantly to the institution's knowledge about the Southwest and provided great information for future railroad building in the area with his description of the geology of the area. When gold was found nearby, settlers began squatting on land across from the fort on the Yuma land. Tensions began to flare, but Thomas was determined to stop any violence from proliferating. He asked his commander at San Francisco whether he had the right to evict the squatters, but his commander gave an open response. Thomas took this leeway to mean that he could do what was best for the situation. He cited the law that it was illegal to settle within 1 mile of an army installation and on Native American land, so he evicted all the settlers, but they rose up and brought their complaints to Thomas's commander, who gave in to the settlers. Thomas was outraged and stated, "I have done all in my power to prevent collision between citizens and the Indians, and up to this time have succeeded, but if squatters are allowed to occupy their lands, trouble with the Indians will be the inevitable consequence." Thomas suffered a year of hot duty at Fort Yuma until Braxton Bragg helped to secure him a spot in the 2nd Cavalry along the Texas frontier. Although it was remote, Francis would be able to accompany him there. He first had to make his way to Jefferson Barracks at St. Louis, Missouri, and he arrived in September 1855. The 2nd Cavalry was a new regiment, authorized by Congress at the urging of Jefferson Davis. Because it was Davis's pet project, it was given the best equipment, including Colt revolvers, sabers, and carbines. They received some of the best horse stock, and they even color-coded their horses to company, or at least tried to. Gray horses were in Company A, sorrels to Companies B and E, bays to Companies C, D, F, and I, browns to Companies G and H, and roans to Company K. Davis helped to hand-pick its officers, and he chose many men from the South. Albert Sidney Johnston would command it as colonel, Robert E. Lee as lieutenant colonel. The senior major was William J. Hardy, and some of the captains were Earl Van Dorn and Edmund Kirby Smith. The regiment left Jefferson Barracks on October 27th. Thomas would remain with this group until November 11th, when he was detached to be a juror on a court-martial duty until January 1856. Before he returned to his regiments, he made arrangements for his wife to travel to Texas with him, and he and Francis arrived at Fort Mason, Texas on May 7, 1856. When the Thomases traveled through New Orleans on their journey to Texas, Francis hired an Irish immigrant woman to work as a domestic servant. In March 1858, the Irish lady would marry a soldier in the regiment and no longer work for Francis. Unable to find help, Francis and Thomas purchased a slave named Ellen. This was the first time that Thomas had ever bought a slave. He had lived the majority of his life away from his family's plantation. However, he did have a slave as a personal valet during part of his military service. Thomas seems to have shared the attitude of many Upper South slave owners that their form of slavery was a paternalistic and relatively benevolent institution. Patrols and garrison duty consumed Thomas's time while at Fort Mason, but in mid-1857 he was called again to perform jury duty for a court-martial. He and Colonel Robert E. Lee traveled to Ringgold Barracks on the lower Rio Grande to attend it, and after 5 months it was moved to Fort Brown across from Matamoros, where Thomas had been stationed during the Mexican-American War. Lee and Thomas roomed together in hotels and tents on this trip, but they finally returned to Fort Mason. In October 1857, Thomas became the acting commander of the 2nd Cavalry, with Johnston being assigned to Utah, where a war with the Mormons was imminent, Lee being on leave, and Hardy being assigned to West Point. The commander of the Department of Texas, General Twiggs, wanted the 2nd Cavalry to launch an attack on the Comanches in northern Texas, but instead of choosing Thomas to lead the group, he passed him over for Earl Van Dorn. Some historians have suggested that this resulted from a disagreement that Thomas and Twiggs had during the Mexican-American War. Thomas continued his administrative duties, but in 1859, violence between white settlers and Comanches on and off the reservation came to a head. When white settlers, afraid that the Comanche were going to attack them, entered the reservation, a battle ensued. Thomas had attempted to keep the peace between the white settlers and the Comanche on the reservation, and he assured the white settlers that those Comanche were not the ones launching the various raids into the white settlements. Thomas attempted to protect the reservation Indians, but the raids by white settlers were too numerous. He, along with the local Indian agent, agreed that the safest thing for the Comanche on the reservation would be to move them to what is now Oklahoma. While Thomas was helping the Comanche prepare for their move, a raid happened and injured at least one Indian that needed medical attention at Camp Cooper. On August 1, 1859, Thomas and 2 companies of the 2nd Cavalry and one company of the 1st Infantry Regiment led 1,100 Comanches north. They were attacked once by a group of Kiowa, but no casualties resulted, although a few horses were stolen. Thomas returned to camp on August 21st, and the administrative work continued, but at least he could focus on rounding up the Comanches not on the reservation and attempt to subdue them. He led multiple raids into northern Texas, but failed to locate any Indians or signs of Indians. He launched another expedition on July 23, 1860, with a force of about 100 men and traveled up the Concho and Brazos rivers. He divided his force, and on the way back to Camp Cooper, Thomas's Indian guide spotted 11 Comanches with stolen horses. The troopers pursued. The stolen horses were slowing down the raiders, so they let them go, but Thomas didn't want them to get away, so he kept charging after them. One Indian got off his horse and began shooting arrows at Thomas. Thomas yelled for him to surrender, but the Indian fired an arrow at Thomas, which glanced off his chin and entered his chest. After wounding Thomas, the Indian wounded 3 troopers with arrows and another with a spear. The soldiers fired repeatedly at the Indian during this melee, hitting the Indian multiple times, but still he fought on. The Indian finally fell dead after being shot more than 20 times. His intention was to sacrifice himself for the rest of the group, and he succeeded. The rest of the raiders got away. The wound to Thomas was apparently not life-threatening, because he pulled out the arrow and barely mentioned it in his reports or correspondence. 1860 marked Thomas's 20th year in the Army, and he received a 1-year leave beginning in November that year. With a year of relaxation ahead of him and Francis, they prepared to leave Texas, expecting to return in 1 year. The Thomases first traveled to Vicksburg to visit George's brother. Then they split ways, with Francis heading to New York to visit family, and then would proceed south to Southampton County, Virginia. On the way from Vicksburg to Southampton, Thomas stepped off the train for a moment during a nighttime stop in Lynchburg, Virginia. Misjudging the distance from the train to the platform in the darkness, he fell off the platform and down an embankment, severely injuring his back. Thomas continued by train to Norfolk, but he was so badly injured that he could not travel by coach from Norfolk to Southampton. Francis came down to Norfolk to care for him, and after a few weeks, George recovered enough to travel to Southampton. He stayed there until January 8th, then left for New York. But he made a stopover in Washington. He visited with Winfield Scott, and they discussed the secession crisis. Then he and Francis traveled to New York. There, he seriously considered leaving the Army due to his injury. The Virginia Military Institute had an opening for Commandant of Cadets and Instructor of Tactics, so he asked to be considered for that position, but did not receive the appointment. On March 9, 1861, Thomas did receive a letter from William Gillum at the Virginia Military Institute, but it wasn't about a position at the Institute. But the governor of Virginia, John Letcher, wanted to offer Thomas the job of Chief of Ordnance for the state of Virginia militia. Additionally, William Mahone, a state legislator from Southampton County, wrote a letter to the governor advocating for Thomas to be given that position. On March 12th, he wrote to Governor Letcher that, "It is not my wish to leave the service of the United States as long as it is honorable for me to remain in it, and therefore, as long as my native state remains in the Union, it is my purpose to remain in the Army, unless required to perform duties alike repulsive to honor and humanity." On April 6, Winfield Scott asked Thomas to return to duty with the 2nd Cavalry and be its commander. Those who remained loyal to the Union were traveling from Texas to New York City by ship, so Thomas needed to meet them there and prepare them for service. General Twiggs, the commander of the Department of Texas, had turned over all their equipment and horses to the Texas government. Although he was still severely injured, he told Scott that he may not be able to take the field as a commander for a few months, but he accepted the job to organize the 2nd Cavalry. He met the unit in New York City on April 12th, and then proceeded to the cavalry training facility in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He arrived on April 14th, and 3 days later, Virginia seceded. Thomas's opinion of secession was not cut and dry, it was nuanced. Thomas did think that the people of the country had a natural right to rebellion, as Americans had exercised in the Revolutionary War, but they could only do so justly in response to tyrannical rule. In the present case, Thomas reportedly said Southerners did not have the right to rebel, as the tyranny did not exist, and they well knew it. He criticized officers who supported secession because they had broken their oaths of service to the Constitution. The government cannot dissolve itself, he stated. It is the creature of the people, and until they agreed by their votes to dissolve it, and it was accomplished in accordance therewith, the government to which they had sworn allegiance remained, and as long as it did exist, I should have adhered to it. Before the Tennessee legislature in 1866, Thomas stated that his loyalty to the United States came from the oath he had taken when he entered the Army. He had promised to sustain the Constitution of the United States and the government, and to obey all officers of the government placed over me. I did not regard it so much as an oath, but as a solemn pledge on my part to return the government some little service for the great benefit I had received in obtaining my education at the Academy. When he informed his family that he was choosing to stay loyal to the United States, his family grew angry, although his sisters were much angrier than his brothers. George asked his sister to send him his effects, including his ceremonial sword, but she refused, stating that if the people who awarded it to him agreed to it, then she would, but not before. He had left his 2 slaves with the family in Southampton, and they were taken care of by his brother John, and all expenses that John had to take care of George's slaves were recorded as expenses owed by George. His sisters blamed his wife for turning him away from the South, but Frances stated that George never spoke to her of such matters. Nevertheless, his sisters saw him siding with the North as a betrayal of his family for his wife. His brothers would forgive him, but his sisters would not. He not only lost his family, but he lost thousands of dollars that he had invested in Virginia banks. Siding with the Union was not an easy choice because he had so much to lose by doing so, but his loyalty to his country overrode those losses. Not all of his troops made it to Carlisle before he was ordered to bring as many companies as possible to Washington to defend it against a possible attack from Virginia. Some of the companies still hadn't received horses, but by April 22nd, 4 companies were ready and led by Thomas by rail to Washington. On the way there, Secretary of War Simon Cameron sent word to Thomas to not move through Maryland because it was feared that the pro-secessionists would become more rebellious. So, Thomas was ordered to guard the railroads running from Pennsylvania to Maryland. To illustrate the uncertainty of the situation, when the 2nd Cavalry arrived in Carlisle, one man chose to leave the army and head back south. When they boarded the train for Washington, a soldier turned to Thomas and asked, "What shall we do?" referring to loyalty to country or state. Thomas replied, "We are ordered to Washington, and there we go. There will be time enough after getting there for you to decide what to do." While in the vicinity of Maryland and Pennsylvania, Thomas was called on to stop a mutiny by a New York regiment who had signed 3-month enlistments and claimed that they had served their time and were determined to go home. They planned to commandeer a train to head back there. At dawn, the regiment stopped the train. Then the men stacked their weapons and prepared to get breakfast before boarding the train. Thomas walked into their midst and announced that he had something to say to them. A large crowd gathered, expecting a speech. When they were all clustered around him, Thomas took off his cap and waved it over his head. At this signal, a battery of artillery moved forward on one side, a loyal infantry regiment moved in on the other, and a cavalry detachment rushed in between the men and their guns. "There is your train," Thomas said. "I will give you 5 minutes to decide whether you will go back to duty or to the military prison at Dry Tortugas." All but 20 decided to go back to duty, and the rest were placed under arrest. 19 of the 36 officers in the 2nd Cavalry resigned to join the Confederacy. Paranoia ran rampant through the regiment and the country. The War Department ordered each man to take the oath of loyalty again. One officer in the regiment called it uncalled for, and when he asked Thomas his thoughts, he stated, "I do not care a snap of my finger about it. If they want me to take the oath before each meal, I am ready to comply." When word spread to the 2nd Cavalry that Benjamin Butler had been defeated at the Battle of Big Bethel, one officer stated he was glad the abolitionist was whipped. Another officer took offense and said he was fighting for the wrong side. Thomas would later step in and say that if the first officer truly believed in his statement, then he was fighting on the wrong side, and then declared there to be no more talk about this being an abolition war. In Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, on their way to Harper's Ferry, Thomas got to spend time with his friend William T. Sherman. Thomas believed the war would be long and bloody, and in that country tavern in Chambersburg, the two men spread out a large map of the United States on the floor and commented on the most vital parts of the country and where they thought major battles would happen. They pointed out Richmond, Vicksburg, Nashville, Chattanooga, and Knoxville as key locations. Thomas led his men into Virginia and then back into Maryland, waiting for Union forces to gather for a more substantial invasion. Jeb Stuart found out that Thomas had stayed loyal to the Union and wrote to his wife that, "Old George H. Thomas is in command of the cavalry of the enemy. I would like to hang him as a traitor to his native state." Thomas and his men crossed the Potomac River on July 2nd, and on their way to Martinsburg, they heard fighting nearby. A Confederate force under Jeb Stuart and Thomas Jonathan Jackson were posed to obstruct any invading force. Thomas now commanded a brigade of Pennsylvania infantry as well as his 2nd Cavalry. His force formed on the left of the Union units already engaged, and they overwhelmed the Confederate force. The enemy fell back and the Union Army captured Martinsburg. Although in control of part of northern Virginia, the force which Thomas was a part of was afraid of being cut off from their base of supplies. Their objective was to block Joseph E. Johnston's army in the Shenandoah Valley from joining P.G.T. Beauregard's army near Manassas. When they pulled back to Charlestown, they skirmished regularly with Jeb Stuart's cavalry, which kept them from realizing that Johnston had moved his men by rail to link up with Beauregard. Thomas's commander was replaced by Nathaniel Banks for allowing Johnston to get away. However, Thomas would not stay in the East long. Major General Robert Anderson, the defender of Fort Sumter, was assembling a force to defend Kentucky, and he was able to select 4 brigadier generals. He chose William T. Sherman, Don Carlos Buell, Ormsby Mitchell, and after a recommendation by Sherman, George Thomas would join them. Thomas was headed to Kentucky and would continue in the Western Theater for the rest of the war. Kentucky's declared neutrality was a delicate situation. Although Abraham Lincoln disagreed legally with Kentucky's right to remain neutral, his actions were that of someone respecting neutrality, at least somewhat. He did covertly supply Unionist Kentuckians with weapons and supplies. The state also allowed for the United States to set up recruitment camps. One of those was Camp Dick Robinson, established on the land of a pro-Union sympathizer. Thomas would take command of Camp Dick Robinson on September 12, 1861. His time as a trainer of soldiers at West Point had prepared him to train the new recruits that he would be coming into contact with at Camp Dick Robinson. When Leonidas Polk led a Confederate force to capture Columbus, Kentucky on September 4th, state officials were irate and asked them to leave, but Polk refused. As a result, Ulysses S. Grant crossed the Mississippi River and occupied Paducah, Kentucky, an action tolerated by Kentucky since the Confederacy was the aggressor in this case. On September 18th, the Kentucky legislature voted to side with the Union. When Thomas arrived at Camp Dick Robinson to take control of the troops he was to defend Kentucky with, he found 6 regiments in all, 3 infantry regiments and 1 cavalry regiment of Kentucky troops and 2 infantry regiments from East Tennessee, all untrained. One aspect of the task before him that he bemoaned to Sherman was that he didn't have trained subordinates to do the necessary paperwork or to help in the training. Thomas was having to train both officers and men in their respective jobs. Thomas was inundated with problems soon after reaching Kentucky. For one, a measles outbreak occurred and killed many of his men. He also had trouble with secessionists threatening to rise up in his sector. A group of secessionists put an ad in a newspaper to meet at the fairgrounds in Lexington, Kentucky for a camp drill. However, they did not say they were secessionists. Thomas sniffed out their plan to form a pro-secession militia and take over the arsenals in northern Kentucky, so he sent some of his troops to that city with orders to arrest the perpetrators. The secessionists called off their assembly when the federal troops arrived. Even though he had only been in command of the camp for about a month, Thomas was drawing up plans for an invasion of East Tennessee to sever the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad that ran from Knoxville, Tennessee to Richmond, Virginia. It was a bold plan, but about this same time, Thomas received a notice that General Ormsby Mitchell would be taking command of his troops and leading that invasion. Thomas was angry that his command was being taken away for no reason. Sherman, now the commander of forces in Kentucky, sent Thomas a message to move against the Confederates in southeastern Kentucky without waiting for Mitchell. This was Sherman's way of helping his friend. If Sherman could say that Thomas was already on campaign toward East Tennessee, then he could be justified in keeping Thomas in command of those troops. Although Sherman attempted to keep Thomas in command, it was a visit by the Secretary of War Simon Cameron that preserved Thomas's assignment. Cameron inspected the troops in Kentucky, partly to investigate why they hadn't launched any offensives. He found that they lacked ammunition, weapons, and supplies. so Mitchell was ordered to stay in command of Indiana and Ohio, gathering supplies to be sent into Kentucky. This left Thomas with his command. This visit by Cameron resulted in Thomas getting 10 more regiments, which he divided them and his others into 4 brigades and identified them as the 1st Division of the Army of the Ohio. He also received a great subordinate, Alvin Schaff. Schaff was a Polish-born officer who had served in the Hungarian Revolution and was an instructor of artillery for the Ottoman Empire. He came to the United States, and shortly after the Civil War broke out, his military experience landed him a field command. Thomas sent Schaff and about 5,000 men into southeastern Kentucky to combat the forces of Felix Zollicoffer. The two forces met at the Battle of Camp Wildcat, where Schaff was able to defend his position against Zollicoffer and send them back to Cumberland Gap. Thomas was delighted with the victory and visited the area and moved his headquarters to Crab Orchard, closer to Schaff's position. Thomas was still planning on an East Tennessee invasion. In early November 1861, a plan had been concocted between East Tennessee Unionists and the Union Army that on the night of November 8th, Unionists would burn the railroad bridges of the East Tennessee-Virginia Railroad so that Sherman's force in Kentucky could invade the region without worrying about Confederate troops being sent by rail to the region's aid. Some of the railroad bridges were burnt, but no army came. Sherman was convinced that the Confederacy was invading Kentucky, so he ordered Thomas and others to pull back their forces from their advanced positions. This decision received harsh criticism, and the backlash was felt by all of the commanders under Sherman, even Thomas, who was ready to start the invasion of East Tennessee. East Tennessean and politician Andrew Johnson came into Thomas's camp and openly criticized the decision. This began an argument between Alvin Schaff and the U.S. Senator, where Schaff threatened to expel Johnson from the camp. Thomas, without saying a word, came out of his headquarters, walked through the crowd, took Schaff by the arm, and led him back to the headquarters. Thomas stayed on good terms with Johnson despite the criticism. Don Carlos Buell would replace Sherman, and this replacement would suspend Thomas's plan to invade East Tennessee. However, it was just a matter of weeks until Confederate General Felix Zollicoffer invaded Kentucky for the second time and set up camp near Mill Springs, Kentucky. The Confederate commander had crossed the Cumberland River, and the heavy rains had prevented him from retreating. Buell sent Thomas to confront him, but the heavy rains also slowed down Thomas's advance. It took 16 days to march 64 miles, owing to the swollen creeks and streams and the thick mud that trapped the wagon's wheels and the men's shoes. Zollicoffer took the initiative against Thomas, approaching the troops and attacked the Union forces on January 19th. The mostly inexperienced troops got their first taste of battle at Mill Springs, and Thomas operated as an independent commander for the first time during the Civil War. The organizing of his troops and their placement allowed for Thomas to concentrate his troops' fire against the enemy. Many of the Confederate units used outdated flintlock muskets that misfired in the damp weather. The aggressive tactics of the rebels resulted in high casualties, and the fact that one of their leaders, Felix Zollicoffer, was killed after mistakenly entering Union lines only added to the confusion of battle and the defeat of the Confederate forces. Thomas pressed on to the Cumberland River, trapping the Confederate force between his army and the river. He planned to attack their camp the next day, but when his men advanced, they found no soldiers, but tons of supplies and even regimental colors. The rebels had ferried across the river during the night in a panic and had left their artillery and around 150 wagons of supplies. The Battle of Mill Springs had been a great victory for Thomas, but he hadn't followed up on his success. Thomas knew that he had committed a blunder. Colonel Speed Fry of the 4th Kentucky Infantry asked Thomas on January 20th why he hadn't demanded a surrender of the Confederate camp. Thomas thought for a moment and then replied, "Hang it, Fry, I never once thought of it." The general had a lot to be proud of, though. He had prepared his men well, and he had inspired his men to greatness. During the morning of the 19th, he put on a brand new brigadier general's uniform for the first time, and while the battle raged around him, he remained calm and in the saddle, so that his men could see that he was exposing himself to danger, just like he had asked them to do. Thomas also was able to place his troops effectively, and despite being about equal in number, he gave the impression that he had the Confederates outnumbered. A fun story emerged from the battle when a Confederate prisoner was allowed to meander through the Union camp. The Union soldiers asked him why the rebels ran in such panic, throwing away their rifles, packs, and rations. The prisoner stated, "Well, we were doing pretty good fighting, till old man Thomas rose up in his stirrups, and we heard him holler out, 'Attention creation! By kingdoms, right wheel!' And then we knew you had us, and it was no time to carry weight." The brief encounter with the mountainous terrain deterred Thomas from wanting to invade East Tennessee. Now, Thomas asked to be a part of Buell's advances toward Middle Tennessee, and he would get his wish. Thomas's division joined Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio in its invasion of Tennessee. That army was on a trajectory to assist Union General Ulysses S. Grant in capturing Middle Tennessee and combating the Confederate Army that was assembling at Corinth, Mississippi. The Battle of Shiloh erupted on April 6th and continued into April 7th. Buell's army arrived on the night of the 6th and helped push the Confederates off the field, but Thomas would arrive late and take no part in the battle. Over the next month or so, a series of promotions and reorganizations took place in the Union Army in the West. Henry Halleck butted heads with Ulysses S. Grant, and to get rid of Grant, Halleck gave him a promotion to second in command in the West, which took his army away from him. In his place, Halleck placed Thomas. Thomas would command the Army of the Tennessee through the siege of Corinth. The Confederates evacuated the city, and Thomas found the sanitation of the entrenchments repulsive, so he ordered an overhaul of the camps to take place. Many of his men fell ill before the camps could be whipped into shape. Once Corinth was under Union occupation, Thomas asked to be relieved, out of courtesy to Grant. Halleck acquiesced, and Thomas went back to division command under Buell. Halleck divided up the armies in Tennessee, with Grant working toward capturing Vicksburg, and Buell capturing the rest of Tennessee. Buell and Thomas moved toward Chattanooga, and by July, the Army of the Ohio was in northern Alabama, with Thomas's men occupying Tuscumbia. While there, politicians and military leaders began to criticize the slowness and timidness of Buell, and Thomas's name came up to replace Buell. The military governor of Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, pushed for Thomas to be given a command to invade East Tennessee. Thomas wrote to him saying, "We have never yet had a commander of any expedition who has been allowed to work out his own policy, and it is utterly impossible for the most able general in the world to conduct a campaign with success where his hands are tied, as it were, by the constant apprehension that his plans may be interfered with at any moment." He assured Johnson that General Buell's disposition will eventually free all Tennessee and go very far to crush the rebellion entirely. If our army will not permit itself to degenerate into idleness, the rebels will be crushed out in 60 days, for the Confederacy cannot possibly subsist its troops a great while longer. In the late summer of 1862, while Buell waited, the Confederate Army of the Mississippi and the Army of East Tennessee began their Heartland campaign that would take them into Kentucky. Braxton Bragg would move his army through the Cumberland Plateau and remain, for the most part, undetected until he emerged out of the plateau either toward Nashville or Kentucky. Buell did not know the intended target. Thomas suggested the army concentrate at McMinnville, which was about halfway between Nashville and the eastern route to lead into central Kentucky. Buell waved off that idea and had Thomas and his army concentrate further to the south. Bragg took the eastern route and bypassed Buell and Thomas. Afraid that the Confederate Army was about to attack Nashville, Buell concentrated his forces at Murfreesboro and sent Thomas to garrison Nashville and prepare its defenses. Bragg pushed on into Kentucky, and now it was a chase to catch up to the Confederate Army as it marched into the Bluegrass State. Buell left Thomas at Nashville while he moved into Kentucky. The Union troops found out that Thomas wanted to attack Bragg in Tennessee, and their opinion of Buell lowered, and their admiration of Thomas rose. Henry Halleck and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton also began to have little confidence in Buell, so they conspired to put Thomas in command of the Army of the Ohio. They sent a staff officer to give Buell the orders. In Louisville on September 29th, the staff officer arrived. Buell called Thomas to his headquarters and was willing to give command of the army to Thomas, but Thomas refused. Thomas would write to Halleck that, "General Buell's preparations have been completed to move against the enemy, and I therefore respectfully ask that he may retain in command. My position is very embarrassing, not being as well informed as I should be as the commander of this army, and on the assumption of such a responsibility." Thomas would later say, "I am not as modest as I have been represented to be. I did not request the retention of General Buell in command through modesty, but because his removal and my assignment were alike unjust to him and to me. It was unjust to him to relieve him on the eve of battle, and unjust to myself to impose upon me the command of the army at such a time." This was only part of the reason why he decided not to take command. He hated politics, and wanted to be assured that politicians wouldn't overrule his decisions. While in Louisville, Buell reorganized the army and took Thomas's field command away, making him second in command of the army. It appears as though Buell intended to use Thomas as his surrogate in places he could not be, but this still limited Thomas. The three corps commanders were Alexander McCook, Thomas L. Crittenden, and Charles C. Gilbert. Gilbert's arbitrary punishments and harsh treatment of volunteers resulted in his men resenting their commander. As the Army was to march out of Louisville to engage Bragg, our regiment hadn't received their pay like the rest of their brigade, and they refused to move. Gilbert arrived and let loose a string of profanity directed toward the mutineers, then ordered an artillery battery to blow them away. When the gunner refused, Gilbert got even more angry. Thomas stepped in, seeing that Gilbert was just making matters worse. Thomas approached the regiment and said in a quiet, reasonable tone, "Boys, I am sorry marching orders came before you were paid off, but we are on a very important march, and in all probability will get Bragg before he gets many miles away. Now if you will fall in, I will promise you the next stop we make long enough, I will have the paymaster there, and you shall be paid before you move again." The soldiers cheered Thomas, saying, "All right, Pap, we will go." The Union Army moved out, and part of it found the Confederate Army near the town of Perryville. Buell sent word for Thomas, who was with Crittenden's corps, to make sure Crittenden got his men into motion and then report personally to the Army commander. Thomas didn't receive the orders until 3 a.m. on the morning of October 8th. Instead of riding ahead, he stayed with Crittenden's corps, and this resulted in him missing the entire Battle of Perryville. The next day, Bragg and his army began its retreat out of Kentucky, and so did Buell. On their way back to Nashville, destroying private property was common for both Union and Confederate soldiers. One incident infuriated Thomas. A known Unionist in Kentucky complained that a Union officer had stolen his horse. Thomas overheard this and asked the farmer to identify the man responsible. He identified an officer, and Thomas asked the soldier if it was true. The officer admitted to impressing the horse for his use. Thomas took his sword, put it under the shoulder straps of the man's uniform, cutting them away. Then he ordered the man to dismount and return the horse with pay for any inconvenience experienced by the farmer. Buell, Thomas, and the Army made it safely to Tennessee, but big changes awaited the Army. While the political leadership agreed that Buell had to go, they disagreed about whom to choose to replace him. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton favored Thomas, but Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase advocated giving the appointment to Major General William Stark Rosecrans instead. Rosecrans had served well in Western Virginia and had recently played an important role with Grant in turning back the attempted Confederate invasion of Western Tennessee. Rosecrans was also a political asset in that he was a Catholic and a native of Ohio. Most Catholics supported the Democratic Party, and anti-administration sentiment and the Democrats were particularly strong in Ohio. Appointing Rosecrans to senior command would help build support among both of these important groups of voters. Thomas was the other logical choice, but his earlier refusal to take command from Buell worked against him. Besides making it seem that he did not really want an independent command, he created the impression that he approved of Buell's leadership during the Perryville campaign and would follow similar tactics if he were promoted. Rosecrans was chosen over Thomas, but there was a problem. Rosecrans was promoted to Major General after Thomas, giving Thomas seniority over Rosecrans. This could cause confusion within the Army, so Abraham Lincoln, with the stroke of a pen, signed an order moving back the date of Rosecrans' commission to give Rosecrans seniority. Rosecrans graduated from West Point 2 years after Thomas and had served in the Army for 9 years before leaving and joining the private sector. He became a wealthy inventor and engineer, but when the Civil War broke out, he offered his services to the Union. He was well liked and intelligent, but he was easily excitable, especially under the stress of battle, which could make him erratic at times, which could cause confusion on the battlefield. Thomas was hurt by this choice and asked for a transfer to spare him the indignity of serving under an officer his junior. Shortly after he sent off that letter to the Secretary of War, Thomas met with Rosecrans and they had a deep discussion. Thomas told Rosecrans that he believed him to be a capable commander, but the decision hurt him. Rosecrans asked him to stay because he needed Thomas's skills. Thomas agreed to stay, but under one condition, that he wouldn't be named second in command like he had under Buell. He wanted his own command, and he received it. He took command of the center wing of the Army. Rosecrans reportedly remarked that Thomas is a man of extraordinary character. Years ago at the military academy, I conceived that there were points of strong resemblance between his character and that of Washington. I was in the habit of calling him General Washington. The two got along well, and Thomas became, according to Rosecrans, his chief counselor. Although not as aggressive as the Lincoln administration wanted, Rosecrans did launch an offensive in late December. Now, the Army of the Cumberland marched southeast of Nashville and found the Confederate Army of Tennessee near Murfreesboro along Stones River. As Union forces assembled, Thomas occupied the center with about 15,000 men. His command was a lot larger, but a large portion was left behind to guard Nashville. Rosecrans planned for an attack on December 31st, but the Confederates attacked first, rolling up McCook's right wing and resulting in Thomas in the center attempting to hold together what remnants of divisions could be salvaged from the retreating Federals. It was part of Negley's division under Thomas that held the slaughter pen against repeated attacks by the rebels, and only after Philip Sheridan's troops had pulled out because of a lack of ammunition did Thomas have to coordinate a withdrawal of his own troops. While his men defended the slaughter pen, Thomas organized one of his brigades under Colonel Moses Walker as a provost guard, whose sole duty was to force the retreating Federals into organized groups to defend the Nashville Pike, the last Union defensive line. That line held by the end of the day, and on the night of December 31st, 1862, Rosecrans called a council of war. His subordinates crowded his tent, seated in chairs and on the ground. Thomas napped in his chair while the discussion took place. Retreat was discussed, then Rosecrans woke Thomas and asked, "Will you protect the rear on a retreat to Overall's Creek?" Thomas stated simply, "This army can't retreat," and went back to sleep. We will never know if this comment was a sign of boldness or simply stating fact, but it was true. Retreat would have been difficult. Confederate cavalry had gotten into the baggage trains in the rear. The Union Army was somewhat cut off, and the only option was to fight. The next day, no attack came. On January 2nd, late in the day, the Confederates attacked the Union left, but were held off and badly wounded by well-placed Union artillery. Part of Negley's division of Thomas's command launched a small counterattack, but the rebels were on the run. The Confederate Army would leave the field, relinquishing it to Rosecrans and the Army of the Cumberland. As one of Thomas's biographers stated, Thomas's actions at Stones River significantly helped the Union Army stave off disaster. Thomas deserves credit for sending Walker's brigade to assist the 9th Michigan in provost duties. With the right wing routed, it must have been tempting to rush Walker's brigade directly into the battle when it arrived on the field at 10 a.m. Instead, Thomas planned for the long term, using Walker's troops to rally men who would be needed later in the day. Stones River stands out as demonstrating the excellent military abilities of Thomas, and it would foreshadow his future military successes. After the Battle of Stones River, Rosecrans and Thomas spent the next 6 months preparing for the upcoming campaign. The Lincoln administration grew frustrated at the lack of movement, and because Thomas agreed with Rosecrans' decision to equip and train the army, he also got a reputation as being slow to action. During those 6 months, Thomas drilled and trained his troops thoroughly. He was a no-nonsense kind of person. One officer described Thomas and his headquarters as such. Thomas was an undesirable person to approach if you had nothing to say. His office was not a place for socializing, and if you had no point to make pertinent for his action, he would fix those cold gray eyes of his upon you, and with his immobile countenance, so embarrass and confuse you that you would wish yourself far away. The war was wearing on him. In his previous military career, he had his wife to keep him company, and he wrote to family in Southampton. However, now his wife was far away and his family wouldn't write him. Benjamin Scribner, who got moderately close to Thomas during the war, recalled a very telling moment. Once, Scribner told Thomas about a difficulty he was having, finishing with the exclamation, "Any man with a heart would feel as I do." Slowly shaking his head, Thomas replied, "I have educated myself not to feel." He uttered those words with lengthened pauses between each, Scribner remembered, as if every one of them recalled some bitter recollection. Scribner's family stayed in Murfreesboro during this time, and Thomas would accompany him to see his family many times. Scribner wrote that Thomas, having no children of his own, took much notice and seeming interest in mine, and would take them in his arms and caress them in a manner that won their mother's heart, and made her his friend for life. One day, Thomas took Scribner's little boy on his knee and teased him about his curly hair, asking him, "What do you wear this for?" The boy replied by pulling on Thomas's shoulder straps, the insignia of his general's rank, and asking, "What do you wear this for?" The general, with a smile, replied that a child's question was more difficult to answer than his own. Many officers would put on amateur theatrical entertainments, and Thomas would attend regularly. He would nod approval at the efforts of the performers and beat time to the music, and when anything particularly comical took place, he would roll from side to side and nearly choke with merriment. A journalist remembered that Thomas always had the best food and drinks at his headquarters because of Thomas's fondness for food. Although not a heavy drinker, Thomas would sometimes drink socially. Rosecrans would begin his advance on June 24, 1863. He chose to outmaneuver Bragg, who had set up defenses at major gaps in the mountains southeast of Murfreesboro. He used Thomas's troops to attack the Confederates at Hoover's Gap, and through a series of flanking movements, forced Bragg to retreat. Over the course of 9 days, Rosecrans and Thomas drove back the rebel army 50 miles. Bragg would pull back to Chattanooga, and Rosecrans would occupy Tullahoma. Rosecrans waited for 6 weeks at Tullahoma, then pursued after the Confederates, who had concentrated near Chattanooga. The Union Army divided to make rapid movements and cut the Confederate Army off from the south, and it convinced Bragg to pull his army out of Chattanooga, handing it over to Union forces in early September. Thomas urged Rosecrans to concentrate his army, but Rosecrans perceived the Confederates as disorganized and demoralized. He wanted Thomas to march over Lookout Mountain. Part of Thomas's corps had made it over the mountain already. Negley's division marched through Stevens Gap and into McLemore's Cove, but had detected a significant Confederate force in their front. Thomas went to check in with Negley and agreed that he should not continue the advance against Rosecrans' wishes. On the night of September 11th, Negley's men fought a rear guard action, as all of the division made it to the safety of the mountains. By September 17th, the Union Army had safely moved through the mountains and concentrated along the Chickamauga Creek. Rosecrans was concerned about the Confederate Army cutting him off from Chattanooga, so he ordered Thomas to do a night march north to be the left of the Union line. On September 19th, repeated Confederate attacks against the Union line forced Thomas to commit many of his divisions to the north and south of his original line to defend against the rebels. By the time night rolled around, the Union Army resembled a question mark as a result of their attempts to hold on to as much of the Lafayette Road as possible. At 7:10 p.m., Rosecrans called a council of war. Thomas reported his actions during the day and then dozed off in his chair. Whenever Rosecrans asked him a direct question, he woke up, straightened up in his chair and answered, "I would strengthen the left," and then fell back asleep again. The meeting ended about 10 p.m., but Rosecrans kept some of his generals, including Thomas, around to socialize. The group would disperse around 2 a.m., and Thomas would distribute orders to his commanders and finally laid down on the ground to get a few hours' sleep. Thomas's men piled up logs and tree limbs to protect themselves from the enemy bullets that they knew would be flying at them the next day, and slept as much as they could. Before dawn, Thomas awoke and examined his lines with Rosecrans. Thomas asked Rosecrans for more troops to extend his line to the north, and Rosecrans assured him that Negley's division, which had been detached earlier, would rejoin Thomas. When it arrived around 8 a.m., he immediately sent Beatty's brigade to extend his line north. The front that Beatty occupied was far too large for one brigade to defend, and before Thomas could send aid to Beatty, the Confederate Army attacked in precisely that sector, routing Beatty's men. However, when the Confederates angled southward to get in the rear of Thomas's line, Old Pap maneuvered his reserves to counter the advancing rebels and broke up their lines, forcing them back. Thomas remained at the front as the assaults against the main line continued. At one point, an artillery shell passed in between Thomas and one member of his staff as they were talking. They gave each other a smile and continued to talk. A few moments later, another shell passed in between them. Thomas said, "Major, I think we had better retire a little." They moved to a little grove of trees and continued their discussion. Thomas was continually concerned about his left flank to the north and assigned Negley's artillery to Snodgrass Hill to watch that side of the battlefield. Intent on finding the rest of his corps and assess the situation to the south where he was hearing heavy firing, Thomas rode south and found Union forces scrambling back from an apparent breakthrough in the Union line. Knowing that the rebels could roll up his entire line, he rode to Snodgrass Hill or Horseshoe Ridge to organize the retreating troops which were congregating there, along with artillery that he had placed there earlier. Troops on Snodgrass Hill were from different brigades, divisions, and corps, but Thomas was the unifying factor because all the men knew who he was and trusted his leadership. One soldier described the scene as Thomas sitting atop his horse, motionless, as sharpshooter bullets whizzed around him. His calmness in the chaos of battle inspired the men on Snodgrass Hill to do courageous acts. As one officer recalled, when it seemed we could not stand the shot and shell that were hurled at us in such showers, and were about to give way, all the officers pitched in promiscuously to cheering and encouraging the men of all regiments alike. General Thomas would jump off his horse, swing his hat, rush among the men and encourage them by his own acts of valor. Another recalled, where the energy of the attack most endangered our line, he strengthened it with cannon and regiments drawn from points in less peril, and when the soldiers asked for more ammunition, Thomas said, "Use your bayonets." The Confederate sharpshooters were playing havoc on the Union officers, sending many of them ducking for cover. Thomas rode over to the 3rd Kentucky and asked if there were any good squirrel hunters among them. The regiment replied yes, and so Thomas ordered a detail of the best marksmen to go out in front and engage the Confederates. When one rebel sharpshooter was killed, the rest fled, and the detail rejoined the regiment on Snodgrass Hill. Thomas grew nervous when the Confederates renewed their attack and he saw dust flying up into the air to the north. That meant that a large body of men were moving, but were they Union or Confederate? Thomas pulled on his beard when he was nervous, and one gentleman recalled that his facial hair stuck out in every direction from so much pulling. However, when United States flags could be seen, he smoothed out his beard and placed those troops on Snodgrass Hill just in time to suppress another Confederate attack. He regained communication with Rosecrans, who sent him no help or ammunition, and by 5 p.m., Thomas needed to make a decision. Part of his command still held the position they occupied that morning on the original Union battle line, so Thomas rode off to see the situation for himself. On the way there, 2 soldiers looking for water came across his path and told Thomas that a large number of Confederates were to the north. Thomas organized his reserve division and ordered them to face north and move quickly in that direction. The attack surprised the Confederates and bought Thomas some more time. The decision was made to retreat, and as the sun began to set, the Union troops began leaving their breastworks and retreating under orders from Thomas. It was risky to leave before total darkness, but Thomas was afraid of waiting too long in case of a major attack against Snodgrass Hill. As they pulled away from their entrenchments, the Confederates rushed forward and took those positions, but luckily for Thomas, they didn't pursue further. Although there was at least one somewhat strong attack as they were falling back, Thomas's troops threw it back and continued retreating. Meeting Sheridan and his troops on the road to Rossville, they stopped at a town where Sheridan made them a seat from a fence rail. They sat down and Sheridan waited for Thomas to speak, but he just stared in silence. According to Sheridan, Thomas looked very much exhausted, seemed to forget what he had stopped for, and he said little or nothing of the incidents of the day. His quiet, unobtrusive demeanor communicating a gloomy rather than hopeful view of the situation. Defenses were set up at Rossville until the night of the 21st of September, when Rosecrans agreed for Thomas to retreat to Chattanooga. By the morning of the 22nd, the Army of the Cumberland were safely in the city. After Chickamauga, Rosecrans' star fell and Thomas's rose. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton wrote, "The merit of General Thomas and the debt of gratitude the nation owes to his valor and skill is fully appreciated here. It is not my fault that he was not in command months ago." President Lincoln wrote, "It is doubtful whether his heroism and skill exhibited last Sunday afternoon has ever been surpassed in this world." As the Union Army of the Cumberland retreated into Chattanooga, the Confederate Army of Tennessee occupied the heights surrounding the city, cutting it off from gaining much of its needed supplies. Confederate cavalry raids tightened the rebel grip around the Union troops, but the War Department was dispatching reinforcements to their aid. Troops from the Army of the Potomac under Joseph Hooker and troops from the Army of Tennessee under William Tecumseh Sherman were on their way to support their blue-clad brothers. Ulysses S. Grant was also made commander of all forces in the Western Theater, and Lincoln gave Grant the leeway to remove Rosecrans if he felt he needed to. Lincoln was now not concerned with Rosecrans' political importance, since the election in Ohio had gone Lincoln's way, so when those instructions came to Grant, he wasted no time in replacing Rosecrans. The order arrived at Rosecrans' headquarters on October 19th, removing him from Army command. Thomas would be his successor, and Old Path was called to headquarters and allowed to read the order himself. They both stayed up late, Rosecrans imparting all the information to Thomas that he would need as commander of the army. Rosecrans left the next morning, and Thomas took command of a besieged army. To supply the army, Rosecrans had contemplated opening up a supply line across Brown's Ferry and Moccasin Bend, but he had not acted on the plan. Thomas would. His engineer, William F. Smith, would make preparations, and with the help of Joseph Hooker, he would be able to push the Confederates away from the location and secure the river crossings. Grant would arrive on October 23rd, soaking wet from a hard rain. He would be briefed about the situation from Thomas and his staff, and once he heard about the opening of the supply line, he gave it his blessing. On October 27th, Union forces opened up the supply line. During the night, the Confederates launched a counterattack, but failed to dislodge the Union forces. During the fight, some mules became spooked at the sound of gunfire and ran into Confederate lines. The rebels, confusing the sound of mule hooves with that of horses, thought they were being attacked by cavalry, which sent them running for safety. The joke became that the Mule Brigade had saved the day, and some even joked that the mules should be given a brevet promotion to horses. Thomas even took part in this fun when a private came to Thomas to ask for him to write an order for the quartermaster to give him a quart of shelled corn. Thomas asked if the man had been given his ration the previous day. The soldier replied in the affirmative and explained, "But last night I was on guard, and getting very hungry I borrowed a quart of corn off a mule and promised to pay him back this morning. You see, General, I am up a stump, and the whole Mule Brigade will be kicking if I don't pay up." Thomas smiled, took in the situation, and wrote the soldier an order for an extra quart of corn. On October 27th, Thomas would learn that he had been promoted to Brigadier General in the regular army. His rank of Major General was only temporary until hostilities ended. In early November, Thomas and Grant had their first disagreement. Grant feared that Bragg would send troops to dislodge Ambrose Burnside, who had captured Knoxville. So he wanted to attack Bragg's army in some fashion. Grant favored an attack on Missionary Ridge, but Thomas wanted to shell Lookout Mountain with heavy artillery and use Hooker's men to attack that location. When orders came from Grant to attack Missionary Ridge and then advance beyond it and cut the rail line to the south, Thomas and his chief engineer, William Smith, personally scouted the front and came to the conclusion that their troops had not recovered sufficiently from the siege, nor had their horses and mules to pull artillery. Thomas proposed to wait until Sherman arrived before attacking. Grant begrudgingly relented, but came away from the situation seeing Thomas as slow-moving and too cautious. Their staffs did not get along either. Thomas formed a small military staff that took military etiquette seriously. Grant's staff had become accustomed to Grant's informal way of issuing orders, and when their respective staffs tried to communicate with one another, there was lots of miscommunication. Sherman arrived and the three men examined the terrain surrounding the city. Grant favored attacking as soon as possible and gave a projected date of November 22nd. Thomas was still concerned about his draft animals' condition and wanted to wait another month. Rains and bad roads delayed Sherman's troops, but Grant only blamed himself for the delays, not his friend. He did, however, blame Thomas for problems that old Pap couldn't control, like the still weak condition of his draft animals. Grant wrote that, "I have never felt such restlessness before as I have at the fixed and immovable condition of the Army of the Cumberland." With Sherman's troops now within the confines of the Union defenses, Grant planned for two major assaults. On November 24th, General Hooker's command took Lookout Mountain. The next day, Sherman would attack the north end of Missionary Ridge, with Thomas putting pressure on the Confederate center. Thomas sent out skirmishers from his lines in order to test the Confederate rifle pits. At about 2 p.m., Union soldiers started coming out of their entrenchments, collecting their stacked arms and adjusting their equipment. As the battle lines formed, the blue troops knew that the leaf-bare woods would provide them with a little shelter from the lead and iron raining down on them, but upon exiting the woods, each brigade either had 300 to 700 yards to march through the denuded valley before reaching the rebel lines, depending on their placement. Sherman's attack to the northeast was not going according to plan, and a message was sent from Sherman to Grant with 3 words on it: "Where is Thomas?" Grant ordered Thomas to launch his attack. Thomas told General Granger to move his men forward, but no attack came. Grant approached General Thomas Wood and asked why he hadn't moved out. He said he hadn't received orders to. He then went to Thomas and asked why he hadn't sent his men in. "I don't know," Thomas replied. "General Granger has been ordered to move forward." Grant found Granger at an artillery battery, personally aiming and firing the pieces. Granger had a habit of playing with cannons during battle, and up until this point, it had been viewed as a harmless idiosyncrasy. But this time, it had delayed the movement of an entire army. Grant approached Granger and said, If you will leave that battery to its captain and take command of your corps, it will be better for all of us." Grant had ordered Thomas's men at the sound of 6 guns, fired in rapid succession from Fort Wood, to assault and take the rifle pits and halt. However, his orders were horribly misunderstood by many commanders, wondering what to do after they halted at the rifle pits. When those 6 guns belched forth their signal for Thomas's men to advance, 23,000 Union troops stepped off, aimed at Missionary Ridge. When many of the first-line Confederate troops began to run away from the approaching Federals, Thomas's troops did not stop at their entrenchments and continued after them. Grant became angry that the troops did not do as ordered, and turned to Thomas and demanded to know who ordered those men up that ridge. Thomas replied, "I don't know. I did not." Grant then turned his attention to Granger and asked, "Did you order them up?" "No," Granger replied. "When those fellows get started, all hell can't stop them." Thomas's army captured Missionary Ridge, and he and Grant rode to the top to observe the captured location. Thomas remembered, "I fell among some of our old soldiers who always took liberties with me, who commenced talking and giving their views of the victory. When I attempted to compliment them for their gallant manner in which they had made the assault, one man very coolly replied, 'Why, General, we know that you've been training us for this race for the last 3 weeks.'" After a failed pursuit of Bragg's army, Grant wanted to relieve General Burnside at Knoxville, so he issued orders to Granger to head in that direction on November 27th. When he returned to Chattanooga on November 28th, he found Granger still there. Granger hadn't received the order until late on the 27th, and he didn't want to get a late start and resolved to move the next day. Grant took this as Thomas and his subordinates being slow and timid and sent Sherman instead. As one of Thomas's biographers put it, in Grant's eyes, Thomas compared poorly with Sherman, who was always willing to take risks and eager to go on the offensive. Even though Sherman had failed to achieve his goals throughout the Chattanooga campaign, Grant knew that Sherman had tried his best to carry out his orders, move quickly, and stay on the offensive. Grant had no such confidence in Thomas. Despite the problems between the two commanders, Thomas would not have to deal with Grant for long. Grant would be heading east, while Thomas stayed in the west. Thomas would adopt and expand military matters as commander of the Army of the Cumberland. For one, he made several improvements to the Army of the Cumberland's map-making department. He supervised the development of a specially equipped wagon for the topographical engineers, which traveled with Thomas's headquarters. The wagon had sides that folded down into desks and awnings that folded out to keep maps and papers dry. Under Thomas, the Army of the Cumberland's map-making department became the most sophisticated such organization in the war, superior to any other topographical department in either the Union or the Confederacy. He worked closely with the Sanitary Commission to improve the environment for his troops. He gave the New York chapter of that organization an autograph to be auctioned off with the proceeds benefiting the commission. His actions as Army commander highlights his caring nature for his soldiers, who did what he asked them to do. That care did not stop when the soldier died either. Thomas helped to establish a national cemetery in Chattanooga for the soldiers who perished in the fights for the city. He chose the site for the cemetery and gave Thomas Van Horn, the chaplain of the Army, the responsibility of getting it established. Van Horn suggested burying the dead in lots according to their state, but Thomas said, No, mix them up. I am tired of states' rights." However, the dead from the African American regiments will be segregated from the whites. The Army faced a large problem in the winter of 1863 into 64. Enlistments were coming up. Many soldiers had signed 3-year enlistments, and they would be leaving the Army soon to head home. The War Department offered rewards for regiments who retained 3/4 of their enlistments. If re-enlistments fell below that percentage, the unit would be broken up and the soldiers assigned to different regiments. A humorous story emerged around this time when an East Tennessee private called out to Thomas, "Hey mister, you, I want to speak with you." Thomas ignored the breach in military etiquette and rode over to the private. The young man asked for a furlough to see his wife. Thomas asked how long it had been since he had seen his wife. The private said, "Ever since I enlisted, nearly 3 months." Thomas laughed and said, "3 months? Why, my good man, I haven't seen my wife for 3 years. The private stared for a moment and said, "Well, you see, me and my wife ain't that kind." Thomas also appointed Jonathan Clem to be an orderly for him and his staff. Clem had run away from home at 11 years old in 1862 and joined the 22nd Michigan Infantry as a drummer boy. At Chickamauga, he had shot a Confederate officer when the rebels tried to apprehend him on Snodgrass Hill, and he forever became known as the drummer boy of Chickamauga. In August 1864, Thomas mustered Clem out of service and sent him to a private boarding school in Indiana. As commander of the Army in the Department of the Cumberland, Thomas had to work closely with politicians in Tennessee, namely the military governor of that state, Andrew Johnson. A board of claims was set up to review the claims of citizens whose property was appropriated by the Union Army so they could be paid for what had been taken from them. Thomas instituted much more strict rules and cracked down on secessionists who dared to claim loyalty after coming under Union occupation. As a Southerner who had suffered greatly for his decision to remain loyal to the Union, Thomas evidently felt especially resentful of former secessionists who now professed loyalty. In late 1863, when Confederate partisans at Mulberry, Tennessee killed 3 of their 5 prisoners, the other 2 escaping to Union lines, Thomas levied a $30,000 fine on all of the citizens living within 10 miles of that atrocity, as a punishment and hopefully as a deterrent for helping aid guerrillas. Although federal politicians had tried to legislate how runaway slaves would be handled and treated in Union lines, Army commanders did not see clearly defined lines. For example, Rosecrans had issued orders telling his subordinates to accept able-bodied men into federal lines as they would be useful as laborers, but not allow women, children, or men incapable of labor. Many of Rosecrans' subordinates disobeyed these orders out of compassion for the slaves, and Rosecrans did not force the issue. However, Thomas was much stricter. He ordered his men to enforce the policy of excluding women, children, and unemployable men from Union lines. He also revoked an order made by a subordinate commander in Gallatin, Tennessee, that required the white trustees of plantations in that area under his command to pay their slaves wages and supply them with clothing. Thomas considered master-slave relations to be a matter of civil law, and he scolded the Gallatin commander for overstepping his authority. When Lorenzo Thomas, the Army's adjutant general, heard about Thomas's exclusion of women, children, and some men from entering his lines, he countermanded the order and had Thomas set up a contraband camp, and he also overrode Thomas's decision with the officer in Gallatin and stated that the soldier could require slave owners to pay their slaves a wage. Thomas considered escaped slaves to be a potential threat to white society and took steps to make sure they stayed under white control. All African American males who did not possess passes were sent to the recruiting office for enlistment or into labor camps. In other matters involving runaway slaves, Thomas was kind. Early in his command of the Army of the Cumberland, a situation arose when the slaves who were working on a fort were not being paid because the Army could not distinguish between loyal and secessionist owners. If their owner was a Confederate sympathizer, then the slaves would be paid directly for their labor. If the owner was loyal to the Union, the owner would be paid for the labor. Since the Army could not distinguish the owner's loyalty, none of the slaves were being paid. Thomas stepped in and, through War Department approval, got all of the slaves paid for their labor. Thomas also hired a runaway slave as a personal servant. When the cavalry was planning an expedition into the area where the runaway slave had been enslaved, Thomas issued orders to the cavalry commander to free the servant's wife and children and bring them back to camp. This all goes to show that Thomas's view of African Americans was nuanced, but it can be safely stated that although he could be generous and kind in his treatment, he still did not trust them and felt it necessary to keep them under close supervision. Thomas also supported the recruitment of African American males for the United States Army as a necessary war measure, but he did not trust them to perform well in combat. When black soldiers were sick or wounded, they were taken to a refugee camp hospital with a higher mortality rate than the white soldier hospital. Enough complaints from subordinates who were involved in the African American recruitment forced Thomas to establish a hospital just for black soldiers. When a commander of a black regiment complained that his regiment had yet to see active duty, Thomas stated, "When you shall have learned cheerfully to perform your duty to the best of your abilities in such a position as may be assigned you, then shall you have learned the final lessons of the discipline which apparently you are so anxious should be taught your regiment." One of Thomas's biographers stated, "While Thomas's racial opinions were conservative by today's standards, by 1863 he was already demonstrating more flexibility on racial issues than most other Southern Unionists, and more tolerance than many Northern whites. Many Southern white Unionists feared that putting arms in the hands of blacks would lead to a race war and other atrocities against white civilians. They also felt that allowing African Americans to become soldiers insulted the honor of white soldiers by placing blacks on the same social level." During the winter of 1863 and into 64, a contingent of politicians and military leaders sought to place Thomas at the head of the Army of the Potomac, replacing George Meade in that role. Thomas replied to James Garfield, one of his supporters, by saying, "You have disturbed me greatly with the intimation that the command of the Army of the Potomac may be offered to me. It is a position to which I am not the least adapted, and putting my own reputation entirely aside, I sincerely hope that I at least may not be victimized by being placed in a position where I would be utterly powerless to do or contribute in the least toward the suppression of the rebellion. The pressure always brought to bear against the commander of the Army of the Potomac would destroy me in a week without having advanced the cause in the least. Much against my wishes, I was placed in command of this army. I have told you my reasons. Now, however, I believe my efforts will be appreciated by the troops, and I have reasonable hopes that we may continue to do good service." In February 1864, Grant ordered Thomas to perform a reconnaissance in force against the Confederates in northern Georgia. This would accomplish two things. One, it would simply allow Thomas to know where the enemy was and roughly how many troops were there. Two, it would prevent Johnston from sending reinforcements to Mississippi, where Sherman was leading an expedition. Thomas moved out and probed the Confederate entrenchments in northern Georgia, but pulled back before taking any heavy casualties. Thomas reported to Grant that he lacked the supplies to launch a campaign, and many of his men were still on furlough. This only convinced Grant that Thomas was slow and unaggressive. This campaign also allowed Thomas to formulate a plan for an upcoming campaign. Some of his scouts found a gap called Snake Creek Gap that, if utilized by Thomas's army, could sever the railroad to the south of the Confederate army. Sherman would take command of the Union forces in the west, placing Thomas under Sherman's authority. Those two had been friends for a long time, but the upcoming campaign would test their friendship. Thomas's great engineer corps in the Army of the Cumberland greatly improved Sherman's chances of success during the next campaign, and Thomas became Sherman's senior advisor. Together, they would work to capture Atlanta. In northern Georgia, Sherman had amassed around 100,000 troops in three different armies. Thomas commanded the largest force, the Army of the Cumberland, with over 60,000 men. Major General James McPherson commanded the 24,000-man Army of the Tennessee, and Major General John Schofield commanded what was called the Army of the Ohio, when in actuality it was 13,000 men organized into a single corps. The Confederate Army of Tennessee under Joseph E. Johnston had around 65,000 men, and Sherman wanted to take advantage of his numerical superiority by using his armies to outmaneuver the Southerners. Sherman liked Thomas's idea of moving through Snake Creek Gap to cut the rail lines south of the Confederate position, but wanted to use the smaller Army of the Tennessee to make the movement, while the Army of the Cumberland held the Confederates in place and Schofield flanked from the north. Johnston was caught off guard by the movement through Snake Creek Gap and began shifting troops to that sector. McPherson hesitated upon nearing Resaca and held back, giving Johnston enough time to create a new defensive line near that town. Thomas suggested to Sherman that they should try another flanking maneuver to force Johnston out of his defenses and closer to Atlanta. Sherman rejected that idea and ordered Thomas to attack. George used two of his corps to attack Johnston, but was thrown back and got counterattacked. His men threw back the rebels, but no ground was gained. Meanwhile, a small group of Federals had gotten around Johnston's flank. Thinking a larger body of men was about to separate him from Atlanta, Johnston withdrew. Sherman used the Snake Creek Gap strategy of pushing farther to the west and attempting to cut Johnston's supply line off, while holding on to and repairing his own rail line to deliver supplies and reinforcements. Sherman attacked Johnston's army near New Hope Church on May 25th and again at Pickett's Mill on May 27th, but both attacks failed with heavy losses. Sherman's armies then moved back east to the railroad. Throughout these maneuvers, Thomas worked actively to reconnoiter the terrain and coordinate operations of his army, often riding far ahead of his men. One of his staff aides, Henry Stones, recalled that Thomas invariably made his way along to the head of the column. If, when he was at the rear, the sounds indicated contact with the enemy, he pushed on to the very front, where he often dismounted and walked to the outer skirmish line to reconnoiter. Nobody ever saw him with an escort trailing behind, dashing past a moving column of troops, throwing up dust or mud, and compelling them to leave the road to him. If anybody had the right of way, it was they, not he. He would break through the woods or flounder across a swamp rather than force his men from the road, and so wear them out by needless fatigue. At one point during the campaign, an exhausted company fell asleep in the middle of the road. An officer abruptly woke the men up, yelling to them to get out of the road that General Thomas was riding through. Thomas stopped the officer and told them to stay where they were, that they would find another way. Another situation saw Thomas and his staff come under fire from the enemy skirmishers far away from their horses. His staff ran speedily toward their mounts, but Thomas slowly walked, paying no attention to the bullets. This could have been courage, or it could have been that his back injury prevented him from running. But either way, he kept his cool even in the most hazardous situations. Him and Jefferson C. Davis found a patch of blackberries and began to indulge themselves in the delicious fruit. When the two came under fire, this time by Confederate cavalry, instead of running off, Thomas stayed and picked blackberries, only saying to his subordinate, "Davis, this is eating blackberries under difficulties." As the Union armies backed Johnston up to Kennesaw Mountain, Sherman sent General Hooker's corps of Thomas's command and Schofield to the west to attempt another flanking maneuver. When Hooker ran into the corps of General John Bell Hood, he reported to Thomas that he had 3 Confederate corps in front of him. Thomas exclaimed that the whole enemy army only had 3 corps, so that was impossible. But he did advise Hooker to dig in at a place called Kolb's Farm, where Hood ordered unsuccessful attacks against the Union troops on June 22nd. Sherman and Grant kept up communication with one another, and when the subject of how slow the progress was to capture Atlanta came up, Sherman blamed Thomas. He said, "My chief trouble is with the Army of the Cumberland, which is awful slow. A fresh furrow in a plowed field will stop the whole column, and all begin to entrench. I have again and again tried to impress on Thomas that we must assail and not defend. We are on the offensive, and yet it seems the whole Army of the Cumberland is so habituated to be on the defensive that, from its commander down to its lowest private, I cannot get it out of their heads." The critique was unfair. All of the Union armies during the campaign were slow and hesitant to launch themselves against the heavily fortified enemy. When the Confederates entrenched on Kennesaw Mountain, Thomas suggested that Sherman move to the east in another flanking maneuver. Again, Sherman rejected the idea, instead ordered an attack against the fortified high ground. The details were left up to the respective army commanders, so Thomas took a division from 2 of his corps, letting Oliver Otis Howard coordinate the 4th Corps' attack, and Thomas would direct the movements of one of the 14th Corps' divisions. Thomas personally reconnoitered the ground to find a weak point, but found none, so he determined to attack the Confederate position where it bulged outward to accommodate a hill. Ordering 2 brigades to form into densely packed columns, hoping to weaken or break the position with the first line and capitalize on the breach with the second, the attack began around 8 a.m. on June 27th. By 10:45 a.m., Thomas called off the attack. The Union had suffered around 3,000 casualties in that nearly 3-hour battle. Sherman asked Thomas if the Confederate line could be successfully broken at any location. Thomas replied, "The division commanders report the enemy's works exceedingly strong, in fact so strong they cannot be carried by assault except by immense sacrifice, even if they can be carried at all. I think therefore the best chance is to approach them by regular saps, and if we can find a favorable position, to batter them down. We have already lost heavily today without gaining any material advantage. 1 or 2 more such assaults would use up this army." Sherman decided to outflank Johnston again, this time pushing him all the way to Atlanta. The President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, replaced Johnston with the more aggressive John Bell Hood, and the new commander would attempt to isolate and land a decisive blow against segments of the Union armies. Hood moved his troops against Thomas's Army of the Cumberland near Peachtree Creek. Thomas's skirmishers detected the presence of the enemy, so Old Pap sent John Newton's division to the front to see the force awaiting them, and he would accompany Newton. He also ordered the corps of Hooker and Palmer to come to the front. Both men suspected the situation to be a trap and began to argue with one another about who should go first. When it was determined the enemy had a large force, Thomas ordered Newton's men to dig in, and by that time he placed Hooker and Palmer's corps to the right of Newton's line. Unfortunately, those troops didn't have time to dig in before Hood's attack. One of Hood's units was pressing into the rear of the Union line, threatening to capture the bridge over Peachtree Creek. So Thomas rode across the bridge and brought up additional artillery to post at the bridge to defend it against the Confederate attack. He used the flat side of his saber to spur the artillery horses to a faster pace and arrived just in time for Thomas to direct the cannon fire against the rebel threat, driving the enemy away. Thomas's line held and only temporarily stopped him on his advance toward Atlanta. 2 days later, on July 22nd, Hood attacked the Army of the Tennessee, and it resulted in the death of Major General James McPherson. Sherman now needed a replacement, and he decided on Thomas's corps commander, Oliver Otis Howard. This infuriated Joseph Hooker, Thomas's other corps commander, because he had seniority. This resulted in Hooker handing in his resignation. After a consultation with Thomas, Sherman accepted the resignation. Thomas would then put David S. Stanley in command of the 4th Corps. In late August, Sherman pulled his troops out of the entrenchments and moved west and south to cut the Atlanta and West Point Railroad. This would result in the Battle of Jonesboro, where by September 1st, Sherman had the opportunity to nearly destroy the entire Confederate Army, since that army was now separated and vulnerable. Thomas advised Sherman to surround the Confederate corps of Stephen D. Lee and William J. Hardee and close the trap, but he ordered the troops to continue to destroy the railroad instead. An attack did come, but it was too late. Hood would evacuate Atlanta and move his army away from the city, leaving it to Union forces. With Atlanta captured, Sherman and Thomas were in a difficult situation, attempting to guess at what the Confederate Army would do now that it did not have to guard Atlanta. Furthermore, now the Union Army had to protect Atlanta and its own supply lines. Sherman advocated for a raid with his entire army to the Atlantic. Grant, Lincoln, and Thomas all suggested a cavalry raid instead, an attempt to defeat Hood and the Army of Tennessee before launching so bold a plan. When Hood launched his own raid against the Union Army supply line in northern Georgia, it was decided to let Sherman execute his raid to the Atlantic Ocean. Sherman detached Thomas to Nashville because there were two scenarios that could play out. Hood would either follow Sherman or invade Tennessee. Thomas was to defend Tennessee if Hood decided to invade the volunteer state, or if Hood followed Sherman, Thomas was to chase after him. Thomas would have 14,000 men in David Stanley's 4th Corps and John Schofield's 23rd Corps with about 10,000 men. His force throughout the state of Tennessee numbered about 50,000, but only 25,000 were available for active duty against Hood. Sherman did order Andrew J. Smith's 16th Corps to come to Nashville from Missouri to help Thomas. Apparently, Thomas thought he would be doing light duty because he sent his nephew to New York to bring his wife to Nashville. Thomas would arrive on October 3rd, and Francis would arrive soon afterward. They didn't get to spend much time with one another, as George was attempting to capture or disable Nathan Bedford Forrest and his cavalry. When Thomas received reports of Confederates on the Tennessee-Alabama border, he suspected it was a small raid, expecting Hood to pursue Sherman. It quickly became clear that this was the entire Confederate Army moving into Tennessee. Thomas ordered Schofield's Corps and Stanley's Corps to delay Hood for as long as possible, while he concentrated as many forces that were spread out throughout Tennessee to Nashville. He also needed more time for Smith's Corps to arrive. Over the next couple of weeks, Hood attempted to get in between Schofield and Nashville, and when he had nearly done so at Spring Hill, miscommunication between Hood and his corps commanders resulted in the Union Army marching past them in the night. Schofield had destroyed his pontoon bridge when he retreated from Pulaski, Tennessee, so when he made it to Franklin, he had no way to cross the Harpeth River. He asked Thomas for a pontoon bridge, but Thomas was unable to get it to him, so Schofield ordered his men to entrench while he attempted to bridge the river. On November 30th, the Battle of Franklin took place, and the Confederate defeat crippled the rebel army. Schofield retreated north to Thomas and Nashville. When Schofield arrived, Thomas greeted him unenthusiastically, but congratulated him on a successful campaign. Shortly after Schofield arrived, Andrew J. Smith arrived with his 16th Corps. Thomas was so glad to see him that he literally picked him up in his arms and hugged him. Hood, in a sense, laid siege to the south of Nashville, building his own fortifications, hoping to get Thomas to attack him. After the victory at Franklin, Grant had ordered Thomas to attack immediately, but Thomas insisted that his cavalry, which had been campaigning for 2 weeks and whose mounts were broken down, needed to be replaced first. When cavalry did arrive, he still did not act. The Lincoln administration grew concerned over his lack of action. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton wired Grant that Thomas seems unwilling to attack because it is hazardous, as if all war was anything but hazardous. If he waits for Wilson's cavalry to get ready, Gabriel will be blowing his last horn. At one point, Grant wired Halleck to replace Thomas with Schofield, but suspended the order when he received a message that Thomas had planned to attack that day, but a winter storm of snow and ice prevented him from launching the attack. Grant told him that he had sent the order, but he had suspended it on the condition that Thomas would attack as soon as possible. Thomas grew resentful of Grant for urging him to attack, especially when Grant had been stalled outside of Richmond. Grant had had enough and filled out the paperwork for replacing Thomas with Major General John A. Logan, who was without a command. He sent Logan to Nashville with orders that if Thomas had not attacked Hood by the time he arrived, then to take over command and attack Hood at once. A few days after sending Logan off, Grant decided to make the journey himself to Nashville. December 14th came around, and Thomas decided to attack the next day. In the pre-dawn hours of December 15th, Thomas checked out of his room at the St. Cloud Hotel, confident that by nightfall his front line would be far to the south. Although all of his army would be making a movement against Hood's entrenched battle line, it would be Smith's corps that would be making the main attack against the Confederate left. General Steedman, commanding African-American troops, got Thomas to agree for his troops to attack the Confederate right, although Thomas had little confidence in their fighting ability. The attack did not go according to Thomas's plan. Fog delayed the attack, and because Hood had moved most of his men back to a secondary line, only skirmishers remained in the front line, so the artillery barrage did hardly any damage. Nevertheless, Thomas's troops broke through the first line and pushed the Confederates back from their main line, but were unable to capitalize on their victory because darkness covered the battlefield. Thomas learned from the prisoners taken that Forrest's cavalry was not with the army, therefore he could assign a more aggressive role to his own cavalry. Thomas ordered the prisoners marched to Nashville, and it would be African-American soldiers who would escort them. Some of the prisoners balked at the thought of being guarded by African-Americans. One man told Thomas he had rather die than be guarded by black soldiers. Thomas responded by saying, "Well, you may say your prayers and get ready to die, for these are the only soldiers I can spare." Thomas settled into his headquarters and sent a message to Washington, informing them of the victory. Everyone was elated. Stanton and his family cheered in their front yard, and Lincoln came out of the White House in his nightshirt, candle in hand, to read the telegram. Grant wired Thomas that, "I was just on my way to Nashville, but now that he had the news of Thomas's splendid victory, he did not intend to go. Push the enemy now and give him no rest until his is entirely destroyed," Grant urged. "Do not stop for trains or supplies, but take them from the country as the enemy has done. Much now is expected." Lincoln sent a telegram to Thomas stating, "Please accept for yourself, officers, and men the nation's thanks for your good work of yesterday. You made a magnificent beginning. A grand consummation is within your easy reach. Do not let it slip." The next day, Thomas renewed the attack. It took a little while for all of his troops to get into position to attack at the same time. An orderly later recalled seeing Thomas sitting alone on a log outside of his tent with his elbow on his knee, nervously running his fingers through his beard as he watched their progress. At 2:45 p.m., the Union Army attacked the eastern flank of the Confederate Army. Meanwhile, Thomas was having to settle a disagreement between Smith and Schofield, who claimed their troops were too weak to attack the fortified position. When Brigadier General John MacArthur informed the other generals that the Confederate position was weaker than previously thought, Thomas ended the disagreement and gave direct orders to both corps commanders to attack. The Union soldiers breached the Confederate line, and the rest of the line crumbled. It was a wonderful victory for Thomas, whose cavalry under James H. Wilson was pursuing the Confederates into the night. Thomas rode up to Wilson and shouted so loud that he might have been heard a quarter-mile away, "Dang it to hell, Wilson, didn't I tell you we could lick 'em?" Wilson later wrote that Thomas, who was famed as one of the most reserved and most dignified men, and who never used profane language, on this occasion he said "dang it" with all the vehemence of an old dragoon. With the Confederate army on the run and his cavalry chasing after them, Thomas began to organize for a pursuit. Not only did he receive compliments from the Lincoln administration, but the cities of Louisville and Cincinnati wanted to send him gifts and money, but he told them to use the money to establish a relief fund for disabled veterans, widows, and orphans from the war. Furthermore, the Union armies outside of Richmond and the Shenandoah Valley gave a 200-gun salute, and on December 24th, Lincoln nominated Thomas for the rank of Major General in the regular army. When Thomas received the dispatch about his promotion, he cast it aside in disgust and stated, "I suppose it is better late than never, but it is too late to be appreciated. I earned this at Chickamauga." Clearly, Thomas was still sore about Grant wanting to replace him. Thomas later said, "I thought after what I had done in the war that I ought to be trusted to decide when the battle should be fought. I thought I knew better when it should be fought than anyone could know as far off as City Point, Virginia." Sherman wrote to him from Savannah on December 25th, stating, "I do not believe your own wife was more happy at the result than I was. Had any misfortune befallen you, I should have reproached myself for taking away so large a proportion of the army and leaving you too weak to cope with Hood. But as events have turned out, my judgment has been sustained. But I am none the less thankful to you, and to Schofield, and to all. Thomas wasted no time in pursuing Hood. He needed pontoons to cross the Harpeth River, so he ordered the officer in charge of the pontoons to take the Murfreesboro Pike toward Columbia. He meant to write Franklin Pike instead of Murfreesboro Pike, since that pike did not go to Columbia. However, the officer in charge of the pontoons took the road as directed by Thomas and found himself going in the wrong direction. He tried to correct the mistake by taking country roads to cut to the Franklin Pike, but the heavy rains made it impossible to cross over those smaller roads. The officer had to double back to Nashville to get on the right road. Thomas never mentioned the error in his report. This evasiveness and dishonesty, which was out of character for Thomas, indicates how embarrassed he was by his mistake. Pursuit of Hood's army began at 9 a.m. on December 16th, with Thomas's cavalry fighting the rear guard of the rebels. The enemy destroyed the bridge across the Harpeth River, which delayed the Union crossing. More rain swelled the rivers and muddied the roads, so much so that the pursuit slowed down to a snail's pace. General Henry Halleck urged Thomas to move more quickly, becoming frustrated at the slowness. Thomas fired back at him that pursuing an enemy through an exhausted country over mud roads completely sogged with rains is no child's play and cannot be accomplished as quickly as thought of. Try as he might, Thomas could not catch Hood. Confederate Cavalier Nathan Bedford Forrest fought an excellent rearguard action, while Hood's army made its way into Alabama and across the Tennessee River. A couple of days after the battle, Thomas went to the left side of his line to examine the field where his men had won a great victory. This section was where the African American soldiers fought. He saw the black soldiers intermingled with the white soldiers, and realized that they had made it the same distance into the Confederate works, and fought to take and hold that position. He turned to his staff and said, "Gentlemen, the question is settled. Blacks will fight." He later remarked, "This proves the manhood of the black man." One of Thomas's biographers stated, "As a professional soldier, Thomas valued courage, self-discipline, and devotion to duty, and he considered these virtues to be among the highest moral qualities that a person could possess. His low opinion of blacks and his reluctance to use black soldiers in combat had resulted from his opinion that they lacked these qualities, a view common among Southerners but particularly strong with Thomas before the war. At Nashville, however, black soldiers not only met white standards of discipline, courage, and duty, but exceeded them. Some of the white units involved in Steedman's attack broke and fled, but all of the black regiments continued the attack, despite suffering extremely heavy casualties. The soldiers' courage and discipline proved to Thomas that blacks possessed the moral attributes that he considered fundamental to full humanity. Thomas came to think that African Americans had shown themselves through military service to be true men, and that they therefore deserved to be treated as full citizens. For the rest of his life, Thomas strongly supported civil, political, and legal equality for African Americans. With the threat of the Army of Tennessee gone, and what was left of it going to North Carolina to attempt to stop Sherman, Thomas was left with an army but no enemy to fight. Grant, Sherman, and Halleck came up with a plan that would rip Thomas's command away from him. One corps would be sent to help in the capture of Mobile. Another was sent to Maryland, where it would be shipped by sea to North Carolina, and much of his cavalry would be sent on raids into Alabama and the mountains of North Carolina. Without a large body of troops to command, Thomas settled into doing lots of paperwork and coordinating what troops he had to deal with guerrilla threats. When Robert E. Lee abandoned Richmond, Grant ordered Thomas to prepare a force in East Tennessee in order to block Lee if he headed west or south, but Lee would surrender before any of that would take place. Before the summer came on, all major Confederate threats had surrendered, and it would become an occupation of the South. Thomas commanded the Department of the Cumberland, and he immediately went to work asking for aid to give to the displaced civilians. He also instructed all local authorities to take control of their districts and enforce the laws as if secession had not taken place. Thomas dictated that in all civil proceedings hereafter, African Americans must be regarded and treated as a free man. Thomas ordered his subordinates to distribute food captured in Confederate storehouses as well as U.S. governmental supplies. Because Thomas had had significant interactions with the now President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, the Commander-in-Chief requested him to come to Washington to discuss Reconstruction. Word spread that Thomas would be transferred out of Tennessee. The governor of that state, William Brownlow, wrote to Johnson that losing him would be a sad day for the state, and the state legislature grew up a resolution to adopt Thomas as a Tennessean. However, Thomas would not leave the state, or at least not the region. On June 27th, the War Department redrew the boundaries of all the U.S. military commands, setting up 5 military districts: the Atlantic, the Gulf, the Tennessee, the Mississippi, and the Pacific. Thomas was assigned the District of the Tennessee, which included the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. At the same time, the government greatly reduced the size of the army, in particular reducing the cavalry, as this was the most expensive branch of the army to maintain and supply. The breakdown of civil governments during the war resulted in bands of bandits and guerrillas roving over the countryside. Thomas issued orders to his subordinates to drive them out of the country. General Stoneman interpreted the order as executing guerrillas, but Thomas intervened and clarified that they should be captured and put on trial for their crimes. Many Unionists from Tennessee and Kentucky returned to their homes only to find that ex-Confederates were their local authorities. Citizens of those states sought to arrest and put on trial Union soldiers for theft, murder, and property damage for their actions as Union soldiers. Thomas intervened and issued an order on September 21, 1865, that prohibited the arrest, imprisonment, or trial of former Union soldiers for any acts committed while performing their military duties. His order would be made into congressional law in May 1866. In one instance, 2 former soldiers of the Army of the Cumberland had their property seized in an unjust lawsuit. They could reclaim their items if they paid a bond, but they didn't have the money. They got an interview with Thomas, who went down to the Justice of the Peace's office and pledged his own money so that the men could get their items back. Some of Thomas's duties were to make sure elections were conducted civilly. He did post troops at some polls that had the potential to turn violent. His most difficult task would be keeping the peace between whites and blacks. He had come to believe that slavery had degraded African Americans so much that it would be an ordeal to bring them out of such a mentality. But they were more than capable of living as free men and should be treated as such. One problem in this period was labor contracts between the former enslaved and their former masters. When it appeared that freedmen were being difficult, Thomas reminded his subordinates that refusal to work under white supervision was understandable, given the suspicion and distrust excited in the minds of the blacks by the knowledge that their old masters were bitterly opposed to their emancipation and would, were it in their power, again reduce them to slavery. Thomas added that most slaves, when removed from the influence of their former masters and subjected to the restraints of law and military rule, are found to not only be able, but willing, to work for their own support. In July 1865, 2 black schoolgirls and their white friend went into a man's garden to steal some plums. The farmer caught them and ran them off, throwing rocks at them. The girls threw rocks back at the man. The 2 black girls were arrested for trespassing, assault, and battery, and put in solitary confinement with $500 bond. Thomas, sensing that this was a way to get the Freedmen's Bureau school shut down by intimidating the school children, arrested the 2 attorneys responsible for bringing up the charges and suspended the 2 public officials involved. Thomas justified the attorneys' arrest and the officials' suspension by stating that they were persons dangerous to the peace of the community and that they would remain in detention or suspended from office until they demonstrated that they possess a little humanity and a willingness to conform to the laws. 2 episodes became controversial for George Thomas as the commander of this district. On one occasion, the Episcopal Bishop of Alabama intentionally omitted the customary prayer for the president and the government from his worship service. As a result, Thomas suspended the bishop and all of the clergy under him from office, and ordered all the churches closed. Outrage came from the South and the North because it looked as though Thomas was interfering with the free exercise of religion. The bishop appealed to Thomas's actions to the president, and Thomas rescinded his order with a statement criticizing the bishop for interfering with the spread of popular approbation and grateful appreciation of the magnanimous policy of the president in his efforts to bring the people of the United States back to their former friendly and national relations with one another. The bishop had used the sanctity of his position to mislead his congregation back into the labyrinths of treason, and in doing so, the bishop was animated with the same spirit through which temptation beguiled the mother of men to the commission of the first sin, thereby entailing eternal toil and trouble on earth. In another instance, the Methodist leadership removed one of their ministers, John H. Caldwell, after he denounced slavery in his sermons. In September 1865, Thomas ordered the Methodists to reinstate Caldwell. The Methodist elders complained to the president, but Johnson let it be Thomas's decision. Later, the Georgia Conference of the Methodist Church upheld the decision to dismiss Caldwell, and Thomas let the matter drop. In November 1865, Thomas brought Frances from New York to live with him in Nashville. She had visited a few times since the winter of 1864, but now she would be living with him permanently. Ellen, the slave that Thomas had brought from Texas, and who had been left with the Thomas family in Virginia, also returned to him, asking to remain on as a paid servant for the general. Thomas asked her to live independently of him, but she insisted on working for him, so he eventually sent her and her husband and her children to Ben, his brother in Vicksburg, to work for him. Johnson would send Thomas on a mission into Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia to convince those state governments to adopt laws that gave African Americans equal rights and encouraged them to ratify the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. Thomas visited Mississippi and Alabama, all of whom refused to budge an inch to Thomas's pleading. After those two failed attempts, Thomas would not even go to Georgia, knowing it would result in the same failure. In December 1865, Thomas would speak to the House of Representatives on the state of Tennessee and other locations he presided over in the South. He was optimistic and spoke about how the citizens of places like Tennessee were going about their daily lives and transitioning into loyal citizens of the United States. He did believe that martial law needed to remain to ensure that African Americans would be treated equally, but was optimistic about the Freedmen's Bureau's work. Thomas would leave Washington only to be called back a few weeks later to meet with Grant, Sherman, George Gordon Meade, and Henry Halleck to discuss the reorganization of the Army. It was decided to have the standing army consist of 60,000 men, and they authorized an increase in the number of generals, affirming Thomas's major general's rank, although he was a junior in that rank to Halleck, Meade, and Sherman. He wrote to Rosecrans soon after the meeting that, "I do not know but that a man in this country does better by remaining out of the army than in it, because generally speaking, officers have attained higher position in the army entering it from civil life than from within the army." For his own part, however, Thomas added, "I have been so long in the army that I could not live happily out of it, and therefore expect to adjust myself as well as possible. If I can retain my present rank," he concluded, "I shall be content," as he had been accustomed to his ideas not being considered when they conflict with predetermined plans. The years since Robert E. Lee's army surrendered had been relatively stable, but with states being readmitted into the Union and former Confederates gaining more political power, attacks on African Americans would increase. White Southerners would lash out against federal policies that Thomas was expected to enforce. When 1866 began, George Thomas had about 25,000 soldiers under his command. By May, that number dropped to 4,000 as his troops began to muster out of service. On May 1st, a riot broke out in Memphis when black federal troops prevented a black civilian from being arrested by local authorities. By the next day, a white mob had formed and attacked the African American community of the city, burning down that part of the city and killing over 40 freedmen. Thomas found out about this riot on May 3rd from the newspapers. His commander of that district, George Stoneman, had not intervened or even notified Thomas of the problems in Memphis. Thomas immediately ordered Stoneman to intervene and put a stop to the violence. The riot was put down, but the damage had been done. On July 3rd, Ulysses S. Grant issued General Orders No. 44, which allowed commanders to arrest violators of black civil rights when local authorities would not act. On August 15th, Thomas had found the instigators of the white mob that started the riot in Memphis, and because of this order, thought he could prosecute them in a military court. He sent off his request to do so, but President Johnson said to let the civil authorities handle it, even though they would not indict the rioters. This angered Thomas, but there was nothing he could do. Violence persisted throughout the South, and guerrilla bands and bandits still plagued the countryside, committing horrendous acts against African Americans and white Unionists. Thomas did all he could to stop such attacks, but his limited number of troops hampered most of his initiatives. In November 1866, a public ceremony was held in Louisville, Kentucky to honor Confederate General Roger Hanson. Thomas wrote that these ceremonies, which he suspected would take the character of a military parade, would be insulting to loyal citizens and would tend to be a breach of the peace. Also, many of the participants in the ceremonies would be former Confederate soldiers, and Thomas considered their participation in a public demonstration that had a military character to be a violation of their paroles. Thomas issued an order prohibiting any military display during the funeral ceremony, particularly any display of the Confederate flag. In January 1867, the citizens of Rome, Georgia, also held a ceremony for General Hanson, but they displayed a Confederate flag. Thomas had the men responsible for displaying the flag put under arrest. He also made a formal statement published in a newspaper. He said, "In your letter you state that no disrespect was intended to the United States government by the exhibition of the Confederate flag. If that is the case, it can now only be supposed, presuming that they possess ordinary intelligence, that they misunderstand the present status of affairs, which is that the rebellion has been decided to be a huge crime, embodying all the crimes of the Decalogue, and that it has been conquered and disarmed, and that its very name emblems are hateful to the people of the United States, and he must be indeed obtuse who expects without offense to parade before the eyes of loyal people that which they execrate, and that their abhorrence of which they have expressed in the most emphatic language in which it is possible for a great nation to utter its sentiments. The sole cause of this and similar offenses lies in the fact that certain citizens of Rome and a portion of the people of the states lately in the rebellion do not and have not accepted the situation, and that is that the late Civil War was a rebellion, and history will so record it. Those engaged in it are and will be pronounced rebels. Rebellion implies treason, and treason is a crime, and a heinous one too, and deserving of punishment, and that traitors have not been punished is owing to the magnanimity of the conquerors. With too many of the people of the South, they are trying to throw the gloss of respectability and thrusting with contumely and derision from their society the men and women who would not join hands with them in the work of ruining their country." Thomas arrested many former Confederates for violating their paroles, like William A. Milliken. His court case gained national attention. Thomas had Milliken arrested for threatening a federal officer, who Milliken said was politically organizing black men. The judge ruled that when Johnson declared the rebellion over in 1866, that parole violations was no longer a valid charge. Thomas attempted to appeal it to the Supreme Court, but Johnson turned down that idea. In March 1867, Congress reconstructed the districts of Reconstruction and wanted Thomas to command the 3rd District, encompassing Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. He made it known that he did not want the job and suggested John Pope command that district. Pope took command of the 3rd District, and Thomas now commanded the newly restructured Department of the Cumberland, containing Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. All of those states were in the Union, so he probably thought he would have less political duties if he stayed in command of them. In the years after the Civil War, Thomas gained a considerable amount of weight, which probably helped lead to his high blood pressure and a cardiovascular disease. His doctor, without the knowledge of Thomas, wrote to Washington informing them that his health would greatly deteriorate if he was moved to the Deep South. The 1867 elections brought more political and racial violence to Thomas's department. Disenfranchised whites who supported the Confederacy became enraged at the thought of African American males getting to vote when they could not. Attacks became more numerous, and Thomas had to send troops to polling locations to keep the order. In Memphis, the city police chief was a Unionist, but the county sheriff had been a secessionist. Violence was set to erupt, so Grant sent Thomas to Memphis personally to oversee that the elections went about without violence. George diplomatically resolved the situation between the two law enforcement officials, and no violence occurred. Of all of the Reconstruction commanders, Thomas stands out as one of the most persistent in pursuing those who attempted to forestall political equality and civil rights of African Americans. The Ku Klux Klan formed in 1866, but began to heavily terrorize the landscape and more specifically the African American community in 1867. Although the state of Tennessee attempted to put down the terrorists with their militia, they needed reinforcements and asked Thomas for help. Thomas more than obliged and used what resources he could to arrest and hunt down Klan members, but his lack of cavalry hindered his ability to hunt down more of them. By 1868, Thomas was disheartened over the lack of obedience by the Southern people. He started out believing that once the war was over, that Southerners would go back to their ordinary ways of life. but it was becoming apparent to him that they were going to fight the social and political change that emerged from the Civil War, even though they had been conquered. The year 1868 was also an election year, and both parties sought to nominate Thomas for president or vice president, although it was the Republicans that put most of the effort in courting him to run for their party. Thomas gave 6 reasons for turning each party down. First, I am wholly disqualified for so high and responsible a position, being but a mere tyro in the science of statesmanship. Second, I have not the necessary control over my temper, nor have I the faculty of yielding to a policy and working to advance it, unless convinced within myself that it is right and honest. Third, my habits of life, established by a training of over 20 years, are such as to make it repugnant to my self-respect to have to induce people to do their duty by persuasive measures. If there is anything that outrages me more than another, it is to see an obstinate and self-willed man oppose what is right morally and under the law, simply because under the law he cannot be compelled to do what is right. Fourth, I can never consent voluntarily to place myself in a position where scurrilous newspaper men and political demagogues can make free with my personal character and reputation with impunity. Fifth, I have no taste whatsoever for politics, and besides, restrictions have recently been thrown around the President by Congress which virtually deprive him of his just powers and rights under the Constitution. I could never consent to be deprived of rights and privileges guaranteed the President by the Constitution as long as the Constitution remained unaltered. I could cite many more equally valid reasons for not wishing the office. I will name only one more, and not the least. I am poor and could not afford it. In November 1868, Thomas traveled to Washington to preside over a court of inquiry for Major General Alexander B. Dyer, and while there convened with Grant about further military matters. Grant wanted to send either Thomas or Sheridan to command the Division of the Pacific. Thomas protested at first, but Grant convinced him to take the position, and Henry Halleck would command the Department of the Cumberland. While all that was being worked out, Thomas attended a party given in honor of the Battle of Mill Springs, and then in December, he presided over a grand reunion of the armies of the Cumberland, the Tennessee, the Ohio, and Georgia, held in Chicago. Thomas gave some short speeches and was given a standing ovation. In May, the Court of Inquiry concluded, and Thomas was able to travel to his new post at San Francisco, and he arrived on June 1, 1869. After 2 weeks of getting to know his new command, he set off for a tour of the division. He first traveled into Nevada, then to Boise in modern-day Idaho, then to Oregon, traveling down the Columbia River to Portland. After inspecting the forts along the coast, he traveled up the coast by boat to Alaska, which had just been purchased 2 years earlier. Alaska was sparsely settled. Many of its residents were Russians who decided to remain in the territory even after the sale to the U.S., and natives who traded first with various companies. Thomas would travel extensively along Alaska's coast and to the Aleutian Islands, where a trading company mined ice for shipment to San Francisco for sale. There were a few military outposts in the territory, so Thomas took a tour of their facilities. Even as an older man, he never lost his love of science and the natural world. He sent some coal samples and walrus bones to the Smithsonian for examination. When he returned to San Francisco, he wrote to the naturalist at the Smithsonian that Alaska would have been an excellent purchase had it been made in '61 and used thereafter as a kind of water and cold air cure for the hot-headed Southerners who fell into our hands as prisoners of war. 3 months in Alaska are sufficient to cool down the most heated brain. On March 12, 1870, the New York Tribune published a letter that severely criticized Thomas's generalship during the Nashville campaign. Thomas suspected John Schofield of doing this, and he was basically right. The letter was written by one of Schofield's aides from notes prepared by Schofield and with Schofield's approval. Thomas decided to write a rebuttal of the published letter and began working. On the morning of March 28, 1870, Thomas's aide left headquarters at 10:30 a.m. Later that morning, Thomas came out of his office, said, "I want air," and collapsed. When the aide returned at 1:45 p.m., he found Thomas laying on a couch with several doctors attending him. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas developed a headache, but he managed to get up briefly and walk around. Francis came to see him, and the couple spoke briefly. Then, according to his aide, Thomas began to struggle with a convulsive movement about his chest and try to rise, which he could not do. Doctors were called, but when they arrived, Thomas had already lost consciousness and would remain unconscious until 7:25 p.m., when he died. When Thomas's body was embalmed, the arteries leading from his heart were found to have fatty deposits, it seems likely that similar arterial blockages caused his fatal stroke. He was only 53 years old. His body would travel to Troy, New York, where he would be buried, but all along the way he would be celebrated at each small and large town. His body would travel to Troy, New York, where he would be buried, but all along the way he would be celebrated at each small and large town. In Chicago, Philip Sheridan and Winfield Scott Hancock presided over a procession that accompanied Thomas's coffin from one train station to the next. Thousands of people lined the streets to watch the procession go by. On April 6th, a memorial service was held at the Capitol attended by President Grant. On April 8th at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, his casket was draped with an American flag and adorned with flowers, and Thomas's sword and a recent photograph were placed on the casket for the public to view. George Meade, William S. Rosecrans, John Schofield, Joseph Hooker, Gordon Granger, John Newton, William B. Hazen, and Andrew J. McKay acted as pallbearers. President Grant led the procession. An estimated 4,000 people and 140 carriages were in the procession. Frances did not attend the services. She left San Francisco a few days after Thomas's body left, so she had a private ceremony after the large one on the 8th. He will be buried in the cemetery of her church. Frances wrote to Sherman after the services to see that Thomas's aides were given jobs in the army. She feared that since Thomas had died, his aides and staff would be forced to resign because of the recent reduction in the army's size. Sherman made sure that his staff all received appointments. Frances would outlive her husband by nearly 20 years. She lived off their savings and her inheritance from her father. In 1879, she applied for the $30 per month pension she was entitled to as George's widow, and in 1885, Congress passed a special bill increasing her pension to $2,000 per year. She would die peacefully after spending a pleasant Christmas evening with her family and friends on December 25, 1889. Although Thomas did not reconcile with his sisters before his death, they did not hold a grudge. They regretted not reconciling with him. As a gesture of reconciliation, his sister Judith sent some acorns from an oak tree on the Thomas family plantation to be planted around his monument in Washington. It seems the acorns were never planted. His sisters donated his sword and some letters to the Virginia Historical Society and recalled affectionately their time as children. George Thomas's name does not command the attention of Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, William Tecumseh Sherman, or Stonewall Jackson, but his transformation from slave owner to defender of African American civil rights and his tremendous military actions throughout the Civil War makes him deserving of being remembered as one of the greatest Civil War generals on either side. His stand on Snodgrass Hill and his hammering of the Army of Tennessee at Nashville demonstrated his ability to remain cool under fire and his ability to inspire his men to great accomplishments. He will forever be known as the Rock of Chickamauga.